online safety. Tackling online harms, especially when it comes to abuse, and tackling this is paramount. That is why we announced the Online Safety Bill, with the aim of making the UK the safest place in the world to be online, while defending free expression. Under the new laws, platforms will need to take swift and effective action against illegal online abuse. They will need to proactively remove illegal content, such as revenge and extreme pornography. They can impose sanctions against offending users or change their processes and policies to better protect their users. The biggest social media companies will need to stop the vile, misogynistic abuse on their sites, and following consultation with Ofcom, priority categories of legal but harmful content for adults will be set out in secondary legislation. These are likely to include some forms of online abuse, including misogynistic abuse. My Lords, we also know that women and girls have been amongst the hardest hit by the indirect impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, both in the UK and globally, including a shocking rise in domestic violence. To respond to the urgent need to scale up violence against women and girls prevention, the UK began the What Works to Prevent Violence. And there is an Impact at Scale programme in 2021, investing up to £67.5 million in the first ever global programme to systematically scale up proven approaches to prevent violence against girls, women and girls, I should say, worldwide. This is the largest investment by any single donor and any single donor government to prevent violence against women and girls globally. Tackling violence against women and girls is a government priority, and that is why in July we published a new Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls strategy to help better target perpetrators and support victims of these crimes. And as part of that strategy, the government also announced a new package of measures which will strengthen protections for those affected by harassment at work. As soon as parliamentary time allows, we will introduce a new duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, as well as an explicit protection against workplace harassment by third parties, for example, customers or clients. We are supporting the Equality and Human Rights Commission to develop a statutory code of practice on workplace harassment, and are preparing our own practical guidance for employers on preventing sexual harassment in the workplace, which will be published in due course. The steps we are taking will not only raise awareness of the nature and prevalence of sexual harassment in the workplace, but also motivate employers to prioritise prevention and ultimately improve workplace practices and culture. Every woman should be able to live without fear of harassment or violence in the workplace as much as anywhere else, and these measures will help ensure that people feel safe and supported to thrive. In addition, I'm pleased to say that the UK Government on the 7th of March strengthened its world-leading efforts to end violence and harassment in the workplace, becoming the 11th country to ratify the International Labour Organisation's Violence and Harassment Convention. This is the first international treaty to recognise the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. The UK played a leading role in developing the treaty over 2 years of negotiations. Attending in person the ratification ceremony at the ILO in Geneva, Secretary of State for Work and Pension, Therese Coffey, has now completed the ratification process for the UK. But it is not just within our own borders that we have a responsibility. The Foreign Secretary is committed to putting women and girls at the centre of the United Kingdom's foreign and development policy, and this will be demonstrated clearly later this year with the publication of the FCDO's new Women and Girls strategy. The Foreign Secretary has made sexual violence in conflict one of her top priorities, and in November the Foreign Secretary announced a new package of funding, over £22 million, to end child marriage, support survivors and fund women's rights organisations on the front line of tackling violence against women and girls around the world. She also made a commitment to explore all options for global action, including her intention to work towards a new convention on sexual violence in conflict. This is an opportunity to strengthen the international response by preventing these atrocities, supporting survivors and holding perpetrators to account. The UK is a global leader on action to tackle sexual violence in conflict. We've trained over 17,000 police and military personnel and deployed the UK's team of experts on preventing sexual violence in conflict over 90 times since 2012 to build capacity of governments, the UN and NGOs. The UK also plans to host an international Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative conference in 2022, and this will be a key opportunity to show UK leadership and rally international support to agree further action on sexual violence in conflict to eliminate this crime, as well as tackling wider gender equalities. I conclude by saying again that I feel privileged to have opened today's debate with so many of you who share my staunch commitment to improving gender equality. I'm proud to be part of this government, and it is an honour to be part of the work we are doing, and we will continue to fight for gender equality across the UK and the whole world. I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
It's a great pleasure to be following the Minister in today's International Women's Day debate. And I think I could congratulate her too on looking so cheerful after flying overnight and being here with us this morning. But I know she's attended a great conference. I've been there myself, and it's really inspiring to be there. But I thank you for at least turning up today after a stressful time. Thank you. So as I say, I'm very pleased to be taking part today, but this is something I raised with the Minister a week or two ago, that why is it taking so long to have this debate? International Women's Day was on March the 8th, and it's now March the 17th, St Patrick's Day, and we have an International Women's Day. So I do hope that in future that we will have it either on the day or perhaps either side of March the 8th, and that we can have it in the Chamber, not in Grand Committee. There's only 20 peers have put their names down to speak today, and I think that's the lowest I've ever seen, to have so few people, so few peers taking part in today's debate. But nevertheless, I'm sure we are going to have a good debate on it. So although women have come a long way in the battle for equality, we know there's still a long way to go. And if we look at women in politics in the UK, since 1918, there's only been 559 women elected to the House of Commons, and in that same period, 4,500 men have been elected to the House of Commons. So it's taken us 104 years to get 559 women elected. So it's not a very good record, really, is it? You know. And there's still a way to go, as I've said, to get equality in the numbers in the House of Commons. The Sex Discrimination Election Candidates Act of 2002, which allowed political parties to have all-women shortlists for candidates for elections. Now, that act included a sunset clause. The act would have expired at the end of 2015, but it was extended by the Equality Act 2010, allowing all-women shortlists to be used until 2030. So I wonder, would the Minister agree to look at extending the sunset clause, which will expire in 2030 unless action is taken? Now, the reason why I believe it is vital to allow political parties to use all-women shortlists is that the elected institutions should look a bit like the people they are representing. And I think it's interesting to note that the new devolved institutions do a lot better. And I think new institutions do much better than old institutions. The Welsh Senedd, for example, has always had a good number of women elected. And in 2003, It broke all records by having 30 men and 30 women elected. Now, this was regarded as a world record, and bear in mind this was in Wales, so it was a really big achievement to do that. Now, the Labour Party has always made good use of all-woman shortlist, and that's why we have more Labour women in the House of Commons and in the Senate than all the other parties have together. But I know some parties are now, other parties other than Labour, starting to use all-woman shortlist. And we use all-woman shortlist not because women can't achieve, it's because all political parties, the local members, don't seem to be too happy about selecting women. And I think that's why all-woman shortlists have come in. We've got a fantastic women in all institutions now because of all-woman shortlists, as I see it. But one thing the government could take action on is to enact Section 106 of the Equality Act 2010. Now, this section says that political parties should keep an audit of candidates, such as how many women candidates, how many BAME candidates, how many disabled candidates. By doing this, each party would have the data and know where they need to improve. So I can't understand why the government won't implement Section 106. So would the Minister agree that to solve a problem, one must have the data to identify it? That is the reason for Section 106. Once political parties publish this data, if they're allowed to do it, it will show for the first time if any action is required to improve the diversity of candidates. Parties can then take a number of measures that they feel necessary, which is what Labour did to increase the number of women candidates. So, does the Minister agree that there's a need for all parties to improve the diversity of candidates, which would eventually lead to all our elected institutions beginning to look like the people they represent? Now, when the coalition government was elected in 2010, one of the first things they did was to close down the Women's National Commission. At that time, the Women's National Commission existed for 40 years. It had 650 women's organisations as partners and communicated regularly with them, including holding an annual conference. Now, the coalition government said at the time that the work of the WNC would be brought in-house by the Government Equality Office. So can the Minister tell the House, how does the GEO communicate with these 650 women's organisations in the UK since the coalition government closed down the Women's National Commission? Now, I've asked this question several times, and the answers I get leads me to believe that the GEO does not in any shape or form do anything of the work that the Women's National Commission carried out. Now, this is such a shame, and an indication that the government has no interest in the work of these organisations, and it does not communicate with them and does not allow them a voice to government as they had during the time of the Women's National Commission. And if we only had that body now, the work they would have done during this pandemic, for instance, really valuable work they did. So I'm hoping the Minister can give me a good answer on that. So, the other thing I wanted to ask is, when is the government planning to ratify the Council of Europe Convention on the Prevention and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which is better known as the Istanbul Convention? Now, this government signed the convention in 2012, but they've yet to ratify the convention, and the UK is way behind other countries who have already signed the convention. So can the Minister give an assurance that the ratification will take place in 2022? Now, I've highlighted several issues which relate to the theme of this debate today, and I would suggest three things to the Minister if she wants to see an improvement for women, and I know she does. Firstly, the Minister could discuss with the Prime Minister and her colleagues on implementing Section 106 of the Equality Act 2010. Secondly, ratify the Istanbul Convention in 2022. And thirdly, find out how the GEO communicates with the 650 women's organisations and all women's organisations, and discuss with them how they are ensuring the work of the WNC carried out on behalf of women is now being dealt with, because that was the commitment in 2010. I mean, nothing I've seen or asked about leads me to believe that that is happening now. So, if the Minister succeeds with this, it will go some way to improving the position of women, both nationally and internationally.
It's a pleasure to follow the Noble Baroness, and I agree with her remarks, especially those right at the start, highlighting the regrettable change from the previous precedents that the noble lady and my noble friend Baroness Northover worked so hard to create, which was the annual debate in the Chamber to allow for all of the considerations for International Women's Day to be carried out. My remarks today will be focusing more on the international side as the Foreign Affairs and International Development spokesperson for my party, and in doing so I also declare an interest for overseas travel, which I will refer to later on. And I also commend the Minister for her stamina for her overnight journey. The Minister is respected in the House, but I hope she will forgive me that I will be coming a little bit later on my remarks to highlight some of the areas where I believe that the rhetoric in her speech is not met with the reality of development policy in particular. Before I progress and depart from where the Minister, I agree very much with the Minister on the news of Nanazine Radcliffe and the others on their return. Noble colleagues, including, and from my own party, particularly my noble friend Baroness Northover, who has been such a consistent and doughty campaigner to make sure that the case for those dual nationals who had been held in such circumstances were constantly on our agenda, and I commend her and pay tribute to her work. The Minister knows that she will be leaving committee to cover the statement, and it is absolutely appropriate that she does so, meaning no discourtesy to the committee. My Lords, I do wish to refer to on the international side in particular. But I will also refer to what Baroness Gale had indicated here within Parliament. I was recently in both Baghdad and in Beirut 2 weeks ago, and supporting the induction of new MPs in Iraq, which is the highest proportion of directly elected female MPs, which is in their 5th term of Parliament after democracy has been restored. Many of those who have been from the protests movement, who have been driven by disgust of corruption in government to be active in Parliament, and their impact, I think, will be meaningful. And equally within Beirut, supporting a project of mentoring and supporting women to be candidates in elections, to overcome, as the Minister said, bias and implied bias. But it's the whole range. It's from actual violence through to political violence, media violence, implied bias and absolute bias. Many women have to overcome enormous barriers that I, as a political candidate, have never had to face, and therefore they are an inspiration. And when it comes to municipal elections and parliamentary elections, then the impact that they will be able to make to transform that system, and in many respects tackle a confessional system which is based in many countries around the world. And any confessional system, almost by definition, have been retaining the patriarchy of structures within society and faith and politics, which has meant that the barriers are hard to overcome. I was struck when Baroness Gale was talking as a former member of the Scottish Parliament, where that Parliament that I was elected to had 40% representation of women in that term. It's declined slightly, which is regrettable, but nevertheless still very strong. I thought I would check the figures, and I commend the Labour Party. Has a majority of its MPs in the House of Commons are women, 94 men, 104 women. The Conservatives, 273 men, 87 women, the SNP 29 men, 16 women, and my own party 13 MPs, only 4 men and 9 women. Now the challenge for us, of course, is when we, as inevitably will happen, grow massively the number of MPs elected, then we will retain that proportion. So that is the challenge ahead, which we will be tackling with relish. My Lord, I will focus the remainder on development policy, because this is an area where I regret to say, Minister, that I think that the government's rhetoric is not matched by its reality. I've previously spoken in the Chamber when we were debating what the prospect of an international development strategy would be. And I referenced the discussions that I've had with my colleagues in our sister party in Canada, which has developed the first feminist international assistance policy. It has strands within it directing future policy of government, but through the gender approach, under the titles of human dignity, quality healthcare, nutrition and education, growth that works for everyone, environment and climate action, climate finance to reduce barriers for women, particularly in the service sector and finance, for investments, for inclusive governments, and for peace and security, all directed through a gender lens and all forming a very strong international strategy. I am on the record in my party saying that the government has an opportunity, when it publishes its development strategy, likely to be just in a number of weeks, for that to be a UK gender-focused international development strategy, and I hope it is. If I understood the Minister correctly, that there would be a separate women's strategy for development after, I think that is a missed opportunity. The opportunity that presents itself is to ensure that the entire strategy is a feminist and gender strategy. And perhaps it speaks to a deeper truth. The Minister said that women are, I quote, at the centre of FCDO. But the government couldn't even bring itself to publish a gender impact assessment, which it internally had carried out, which had predicted that programmes supporting women and girls would be disproportionately affected across all ranges of development policy, all of the areas where the Minister had highlighted. The government officials knew themselves that the spending cuts, the unlawful reduction from 0.7% to 0.5%, would disproportionately affect women and girls. And we've seen it most clearly as a result of the pandemic, which has seen women and girls struggle far more and be disproportionately affected by the global response. And as far as the development policy when it comes to physical violence, well, Minister, according to the UN assessments, which I regularly review, for Sustainable Development Goal 5 for equality for women, highlights that there are 736 million women who still suffer physical violence, which has been relatively unchanged over the last decade. But as we learnt through a leak, the government's own gender impact assessment for its own cuts had highlighted that there would be a 70 to 80% cut in programmes for violence against women internationally. And it is simply not credible to say that the UK is a global leader. With regards to girls' education, of course it is welcome that there was a £430 million declaration. But that is over 5 years, and it backfills cuts. And therefore, we know that there will be 700,000 fewer girls receiving education. That would have been the case if development cuts had not been put in place. And the Minister refers to the Foreign Secretary referring to restoring cuts for women and girls programmes before the decision to cut overall. That was 4 months ago, and we're still yet to see any programmes about any of the cuts. And because the 0.5% is capped, we know that any restoration of those will displace other programmes. And when we know that one of the secondary impacts of the Ukrainian crisis has been the increase in food, and there's no lift of the 0.7% cap, then any support for Ukraine, which is fully justified, will be squeezing out other programmes. And that is £220 million for Ukraine, which is welcome, but that means £220 million less for other programmes, especially that we know for women who are disproportionately affected by conflict areas. And let me close by giving just 2 examples of where they may be. Last week I was in Sudan, and the country to its immediate south, South Sudan, the UK has effectively, through the Crown Agents, been supporting the delivery of health care. South Sudan is the country where if you are a woman giving birth, as UNICEF had put it so horrifically, giving birth on the floor, cutting the umbilical cord with a stick, that is the reality for some women in South Sudan. We have cut our health support for South Sudan by 10%, and quite unbelievably, there is another round of discussions which have not yet concluded about further cuts. And this is a country where 1 in 10 babies die before the age of 5. And we also know that the horrific conflict within Yemen, women and girls has been disproportionately affected, and more people rely on food programme areas than in many places on earth. And that cost for their food has gone up, and we have cut by nearly 60% our support for women within Yemen. So it is correct to highlight progress in certain areas, and I welcome that. It is also, I think, very important that we are self-aware of the damage that is being done, the moral vacuum that is being caused, and the fact that we are simply not seen around the world as a global leader. And when we say we want to rally international support and we ask those to step up, then other countries in the world are having to backfill areas where we have retreated and cut. And that is not, I think, the backdrop for what we should be seeing the international development strategy to be. It isn't too late. We should be lifting the target back to 0.7% immediately. We should have a feminist development strategy, and we should act on all of the worthy ambitions, which I hope we all share.
Pleasure to speak in today's debate and follow the Noble Lord Purvis of Tweed, and like him will begin by focusing particularly on international issues. I did put the word around to see if any of my female colleagues were available, because they are more qualified to speak than I. But none of them were available today, so you have to put up with me. Thank you, however. I am glad to have this opportunity. Firstly, there is much I want to celebrate. As part of my brief, I take special interest in 2 of the poorest nations on earth. One of the others is South Sudan, but Burundi and Lesotho. These nations are making great progress on women's equality. It's been my privilege to visit Lesotho a couple of times and Burundi very many times. And I'd like to share some examples. This month, the Women's Investment and Development Bank has been introduced in Burundi and has been praised by the UN as a step towards women's economic empowerment in that nation. This bank will grant low-interest loans to women's collectives and their development projects and will provide training on profitable business. No one would be surprised that another of my particular interests is how the church operates in these countries. And I want today to recognise the incredible work of the Mothers' Union worldwide. And one such branch that works tirelessly on this front in Burundi, campaigning for equality for women and girls all over the world. I want to mention the national leader of the Mothers' Union, Mrs. Claudette Kigeme in Burundi. She coordinates that work. She works also with the agency 5 Talents, and they set up savings-led rural community groups to train people in growing small businesses. It's been my and my wife's privilege to visit a number of those small financial units and to hear the testimonies, interestingly, sometimes of the men as well as the women, of the impact that microfinance has had on their lives and on developing their savings groups. It has utterly transformed their lives, and it has empowered the women, because often alongside the microfinance they do literacy training and business training, because they recognise that actually the best business people in Burundi are the women. They are much more entrepreneurial, they are much more reliable to run their businesses well, and that's where the testimony of the men sometimes comes in, because I've stood in those groups and I've had men stand up in front of me saying, my life has been transformed by the way that my wife has been empowered and has developed and changed our whole lives. Mrs. Claudette Kigemi was recently honoured by the Archbishop of Canterbury for her work by being given the Langton Award. A second of my friends in Burundi is Mathilde Unkwirichie. Hansard, I've sent you the spelling. Mathilde has led the way in many aspects of fighting for gender justice and equality for women in Burundi. One of the issues that she and others are currently working on is the right of women to access to land. Currently, the law in that land does not allow women to inherit the land. Now, when you are an agriculturally based economy, that is a massive injustice that needs to be corrected, and Mathilde is one of the women leading the way to see that law changed. Mathilde has championed women's rights, she's led work against gender-based violence, and she's engaged in international peacemaking. These two women are utterly remarkable, and I want to honour them. They have changed my life by meeting them and seeing them at work. I want to mention a third. I want to go to Lesotho now, to the new Bishop of Lesotho, the Right Reverend Dr. Vincentia Kugabi. She was only appointed at the end of last year. She is the first woman bishop of Lesotho, and she is only the third woman bishop in the province of Southern Africa. I contacted her about this debate, and I asked her what she would want to say about the situation in Lesotho and Southern Africa. She pointed out that she is a leader still in a patriarchal country whose top leadership remains a male domain. She notes that education remains male-oriented, that exposure, mentoring and support structures necessitated her to work harder than any of the men in order to counter it. She is a leader of steady and intentional progress to narrowing the gender gap in Lesotho. She stands as a great figure of reconciliation. Sadly, the story of the church in recent years, the Anglican Church in Lesotho, has been riven with disputes. And one of the reasons that she was appointed as the bishop from outside Lesotho, she was within South Africa, she was placed in there because it was recognised that actually a woman leader at this point was the most likely person who would bring reconciliation in conflict. After hearing these examples, a couple of questions from the Minister. Will she affirm the leading role played by civil society and the Church and the other faith organisations in addressing gender-based violence and working for equality in many poorer nations? And will she confirm the commitment of Her Majesty's Government in using overseas aid and development spending to assist this work? And will she, following up Lord Purvist's question, will she tell us when we are going to return to 0.7%, please? There are many more celebrations than challenges, but I turn to the latter. I noted the Minister detailing ways in which the Government is encouraging women here with work incentives and childcare programmes. These are welcome. However, the reality is that the gender gap is arguably at its worst for women with young children. This is especially so where they have a larger family. Now, the noble lords and ladies, certainly, and the Labour Minister, know this, and that you know my passion about this issue. The two-child limit is a policy against which I've campaigned since its outset for a whole range of reasons. But a reason pertinent to today's debate is its disproportionate effect on women. The Child Poverty Action Group estimates that 29% of households affected by the policy are single-parent families headed by women, compared to only 1% of single-parent families headed by men. The Pregnancy Advisory Service report that during the pandemic, respondents to their survey described being forced by their financial circumstances into ending a pregnancy they otherwise would have wanted. Has the noble lady, the Minister, carried out any assessment of the two-child limit policy impact specifically on women and the poverty of women with more than two children? I hope she will consider to undertake one if she has not. I look forward to hearing the noble lady and the Minister's responses both to the international questions and to this specific one around the two-child limit in due course.
My Lords, it is a pleasure to follow the Right Reverend Prelate, and can I say how wonderful it is that so many men are speaking in this debate today. I think we have nearly as many men speaking as women, and thank you to all the men who are here to support us. My Lords, I thank my noble friend the Minister for finding time, having come back overnight as we've heard, for this important debate today to mark International Women's Day, and for her introduction. And can I congratulate her on her speech at the CSW at the UN. This is our opportunity to pause and reflect on the status of women, both here and across the world. Before I begin, I'd like to draw attention, as normal, to my various roles listed on the Register of Interest. My Lords, this debate is usually a time to celebrate progress and achievements, but this year I feel that we are in a difficult place. Without doubt, the women who are most at risk and with least rights are those in conflict countries and unstable situations. The scenes coming out of Ukraine are truly horrific. It feels very close. And I'm delighted that the UK is being so strongly supportive, and I applaud how generous the British people are in responding to help through donating through the Ukraine humanitarian appeal and sending clothes and supplies and offering accommodation. We have seen heartrending pictures of women and children trying to leave the country and escape the cruel bombardment by the Russians. But sadly, Ukraine is only the most recent example of war. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre report that there are currently 45 countries affected by conflict and violence. And this is on top of the state of the crisis induced by over 2 years of COVID, the COVID pandemic, which, as the Noble Lord Purvis has already told us, typically hit women and girls the hardest. The UN reports that violence, conflict, political and humanitarian crises have displaced 82.4 million people from their homes. 115 million people across the world are living in extreme poverty, and 100 million do not have enough to eat, up from 77 million last year. Around the world, from Afghanistan to Ethiopia to Myanmar to the DRC, women's human rights defenders have come under attack, and the wave of political violence against women in politics and the media has risen. In short, my lords, the rights of women and girls have been significantly rolled back on all fronts, and I fear that we are in no way near this year's theme for International Women's Day of Break the Bias. Whilst the media spotlight is on Ukraine, we must not forget the situation in other conflicts. Only last week it was the 11th anniversary of the Syrian uprising. And we should not forget the terrible scenes in Afghanistan last August with the takeover by the Taliban. The UK had spent 20 years helping to bring democracy and order to the country. Was it perfect? No. But it was a great deal better off than it had been in 2001, when it was described as the country that was worst in the world to be a woman, with no women being seen in public. With encouragement and support, so many brave women came forward to take their part in society. There were women MPs, women judges, women ministers, diplomats in the army, police, teachers, lawyers, in all professions. And yet, today, once again, the Afghanistan women are being brutally suppressed. Women who've had a public life have had to flee for their lives and are still in for hiding. Many are stuck in third countries, and once again they have been airbrushed out of public life. I have been helping to coordinate a group of senior women Afghan refugees here, former ministers, judges, lawyers, MPs, as they try to come to terms with what has happened and how they would like to see the future for their country going forward. We must not let them be airbrushed out of the international scene and forgotten. And I'd like to thank my noble friend Lord Ahmad for having helped facilitate these meetings and taking the time to come and meet these women. Now more than ever, it is vital to include women's voices in peace processes. Evidence that gender equality is essential to building peace and security has grown substantially since UN Security Council 1325 was adopted in 2000. In fact, involving women increases the chances of longer-lasting, more sustainable peace, and yet women continue to be excluded. My lords, you cannot build peace by leaving out half the population. Look at Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan. We shouldn't have to justify why women should be included. We should ask the men with guns why they are there when they have caused all that misery. So how do we ensure that women will be able to play a meaningful role and their voices will be heard? Will the Minister agree with me that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is now more important than ever and should be a core part of every FCDO policy? I very much welcome the Foreign Secretary's commitment to increasing the spending on women and girls back to previous levels and look forward to hearing the new strategy. And I also welcome her renewed energy to the vital Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict agenda. I'm delighted that we're going to be having another conference in the autumn. We simply must not give up on this agenda after all the work that was put in and the progress that was made. This was always going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And we must take care not to risk losing the progress already made by allowing language used around the PSVI and international commitments to be watered down. And what steps can, I ask my noble friend the Minister, what steps can be taken in tandem to push for greater implementation and holding perpetrators to account? My Lords, as we've already heard, this week is the Commission for the Status of the Women meeting at the UN in New York, which I and others have previously been to. Have we heard anything about it in the press? I wonder if any of the men present even know what it is. It is the second largest meeting at the UN during the year, and yet there is a conspiracy of silence. We urgently need to make changes to this meeting to ensure that it is used as a platform to amplify the voices of women being persecuted across the world. My Lords, I end by quoting Sheryl Sandberg. In the future, there will be no female leaders. There will just be leaders. And I think that we may find that they will deliver a much more peaceful world.
Great pleasure to follow the noble lady. I have indeed attended the meeting in New York with her in the past, and I know her commitment to working with women in conflict areas, and I've learned a lot from her about that. But, my lords, she is also right that we're meeting at a very difficult time to talk about this. The pandemic has exposed the risks that women face here and around the world. Here we've seen frightening levels of domestic abuse and of sexual exploitation, with perpetrators taking advantage of lockdown. Changing Lives, a charity I've worked with and had long association with, based in the North East, did some work to look at the particular exploitation of young women on the internet. It was really scary, and it is something that young women of today have got to face in a way that my generation never had to. And I hope the bill is able to help deal with that. But I particularly, inevitably, today want to talk about the position of women in the developing world and the increasing evidence that our decision to restrict aid has had a negative effect, really difficult and bad effects on millions of women. High Commissioners and children, as well as High Commissioners as well as charities, are clear that development has not just stalled during the pandemic, but has actually gone backwards by, they tell me, at least 10 years. And this, of course, affects everyone in the developing world, but it particularly affects women and children. They've been hit by a range of global crises almost intersecting. They're at the forefront of the climate emergency, experiencing extreme weather events such as drought and floods more frequently, and the effect that that has on their ability to find water for their families, their ability to grow food for their families and their villages, and so on. Women are increasingly experiencing a higher burden of care from both climate change and the impact of COVID-19. I was very pleased to hear that the Minister is proud to champion the drive to tackle inequalities. The problem is that at the moment, this is just not working from the government. I hear the rhetoric, I hear the determination, but on the ground, I also hear how much more difficult things are than in the last few years, certainly predating the pandemic. There's a rollback on women's rights globally. Space for engagement by women in decision-making process is shrinking. Inequality of opportunity, which affects access to health, education and income, are increasing and exacerbating discrimination against women. And you think, too, of the horror of children not even being able to attend primary school in the last couple of years, and that means that there's another huge backlog to actually get them to anywhere near being able to do STEM subjects, I have to say. And I met some young people from Kenya virtually quite recently, and their schools were closed for virtually 2 years. And the inability to actually catch up in those circumstances is just terrifying. Many people and organisations work in this area, and inevitably, I'm sure you'll all say she's doing it again, but I do want to mention just VSO, partly because, of course, I know the level of transformation that VSO can make to both volunteers and those they're working with. But I want to talk about one thing that I'm not sure the government, or at least the Minister, is really aware of, how the change in VSO. It's such a much better organisation now than when I worked for it many years ago. But they recruit and train volunteers within the developing country, not just from this country. And that means they are training the potential leaders for tomorrow. And they are giving them skills, confidence, they're giving them voice. And I have met young people in this place 3 weeks ago who returned from a programme that was initiated by the coalition government called ICS that VSO hosted. And I met young people who had come back from that, who'd been working on gender-based violence in different countries, in Africa and in Pakistan. And they are remarkable, absolutely remarkable about what they learned but also about how that has changed, how they see things in this country and what they're prepared to do and how they are working. Now that programme finished, and I know the government is now trying to find ways of getting it re-going, even though, of course, all the people who are employed here and around the world lost their jobs, and so you've got to start again to build the infrastructure. But I really would say to the Minister, she would be inspired if she met some of these young people, and, you know, that can be organised very easily. I've met some of the young people who were part of the African teams, because every team from this country is matched by a team of local volunteers. And they too, very clearly, had developed leadership skills and their own confidence and their resilience and their determination to work on issues that would improve their communities. And, you know, that's what we need internationally. And actually, our aid cuts are undermining that. Now, yes, VSO has been given money for the next 3 years. I have to say it's a lot less than when I was last on their board. They were given for a year, but, you know, they will continue to work and do what they can, even though it is in far fewer countries than they used to work in. And I'm sure that they're talking to the government about reinstituting the ICS programme. But there is so much we know that does work. And yet, we thought in this country that cutting aid was going to be beneficial to us. It's not beneficial to us because we lose that quality of leadership, of determination, of knowledge of how things work in the world. But it's certainly not beneficial to the countries that we've been working with. And so I, too, say to the Minister, it is absolutely critical to at least restore to 0.7. This is not just about the reputation of the country. This is about the opportunity of people around the world, but also opportunities for people in this country to grow, to understand what's going on in the world, and to contribute to it. But it is particularly pertinent for women, because most of our aid was going on women and on children and young people, and they're the ones who are suffering most coming out of COVID. They're the ones who are suffering most from climate change. We really do have the responsibility to be better.
Yeah. My Lords, the International Women's Day debate gives us an opportunity to highlight the empowerment and success of women around the world, as well as inequalities, discrimination, violence and oppression faced by women in various parts of the world. Violence against women remains a major issue in the development and advancement of women. The violation of women's rights during conflicts has remained an issue in the 20th century, and if not corrected, it will surely affect women not only in the 21st century, but also in the next millennium. As per reports of the various NGOs and human rights agencies, hundreds of thousands of women have been the target of sexual crimes at the hands of armed forces in Rwanda, Bosnia, Myanmar, Kashmir and elsewhere. These NGOs have documented incidents of gang rape of young girls and grandmothers alike. Sexual abuse, sometimes in the presence of male family members, is used as a weapon of war. Rape by armed forces is indeed a gross violation of international human rights and humanitarian law, and has to be condemned. The report of the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women noted that rape is the destructive combination of power, anger, and sex which incites sexual violence against women. The victim of rape suffers a disorder, anxiety, and the rape trauma syndrome, which causes them to constantly relive their rape through a series of flashbacks, dreams, nightmares, and body memories. My Lords, today I'm focusing my comments to misery and suffering of women of Kashmir. As the Amnesty International, the Human Rights Watch, the United Nations Commission for Human Rights, and many other credible organisations have time and time again reported that the Indian Army is involved in illegal detentions, torture, extrajudicial killing and rape in Indian-administered Kashmir over the years. All of this is happening with a complete impunity under the Indian Armoured Special Power Act. According to recent reports of the Genocide Watch, Kashmir is at the verge of genocide. Yet the world powers, including Britain, choose to ignore these warnings. More than 100,000 people, according to reports, more than 100,000 people have been killed so far in Kashmir, whilst thousands of men and women are locked up in prisons across India. Thousands of women are known as half-widows whose husbands are missing. The discovery of more than 3,000 mass graves adds to their agony, not knowing if their missing husbands or family members are among those buried in these mass graves. Constant curfews, crackdowns, house-to-house searches, arrests, torture and communication shutdowns have become part of the daily life for women in Kashmir. There are many well-documented and widely reported rape cases at the hands of the Indian security forces. According to the various reports, in 1991, as many as 100 women and girls were gang raped by Indian troops at Kunanposhpura in district Kupwara in Kashmir. 2 women, Asia and Nilofar, were abducted, raped and subsequently killed by men in uniform in Shopian in May 2009. A 9-year-old Asifa Bano was abducted and gang raped by Indian police personnel and fanatics affiliated with Hindu extremist groups in Kathua area of Jammu region in January 2018, and the list goes on. My Lords, last week I received a letter from the Chief Executive of the Luton Borough Council. The letter reads as following. At the Council meeting held on the 25th of January 2022, the following motion was put forward, and I quote, Luton Council raises awareness of the plight of the women of Kunanposhpura village in Kupwara district in Kashmir. These women and girls have been fighting for justice after being gang raped in 1991. Human rights organizations determined that at least 100 women were gang raped by the Indian Army in a horrific event. These women have never received any support from the government of India and still wait for justice. The psychological effect of this have tarnished their lives. The motion goes on to say, although we cannot change the past, this Council can help to raise the public awareness of this egregious event, condemn and abhors violence against women in all its forms and against whomever it takes place, and request our both local members of Parliament and Lord Qurban Hussain to raise this in the Parliament, to take the matter to the Government of India, and ask the Supreme Court of India to take all reasonable steps to support these women in their campaign to obtain justice, and to request an update report back on this case, quote unquote. My Lords, on behalf of Luton Borough Council and more than a million British Kashmiris, I put this case before you as a testimony. I ask the Minister what our government has done so far to raise the grave human rights situation in Kashmir with the Government of India and what response they have received. Furthermore, can the Minister promise to raise the issue of human rights in Kashmir, particularly the case of Kunanposhpura gang rape, with the Indian government, and at the next opportunity, and write back to me with the response as per request from the Luton Borough Council. And finally, in presence of these serious reports of human rights abuses in Kashmir produced by Genocide Watch and other credible NGOs, Can the Honourable Lord or the Honourable Baroness, the Minister, say why India is not included on the FCDO's annual report of human rights priority countries, and can she assure the House that it will be included in future reports?
It's an honour to follow Lord Hussain and his sobering report on the plight of women and children in Kashmir, of which I certainly was not aware. My Lords, to mark International Women's Day, I wish today to look at to sort of step back and look at the gifts and qualities that women bring to the whole of human life, which are often unrecognised and undervalued, but which, if they were more valued and recognised, would certainly help in furthering and protecting their equality in the UK and globally. As American comedian Rhonda Hansome says, a man's got to do what a man's got to do, a woman must do what he can't. The most obvious is that women bear and give birth to the next generation. We ignore the qualities women bring to their roles as homemakers and child rearers at our peril. Of course, they do so much more than that, and men often now take a home front role. But women are almost always the central hub figures in families. This is not just gender stereotyping. Research has found it is much more common for a woman than a man to know her children's friends, hopes, dreams, romances, secret fears, what they are thinking, how they are feeling, and when their doctor's appointments are. Whilst there is infinite variability within the two sexes, there are clear sex-based differences in tendencies flowing from differences in how male and female brains tend to be wired and their respective physiology. Hence the government bringing forward a women's health strategy and, I hope, a men's strategy following the report from the APPG for Men and Boys, for which I am a vice chair. Differences are wired into us at the deepest level, for instance, in terms of hearing. Women's discomfort level is half that of men. Smell. Women are relatively sensitive and men are relatively insensitive. Touch. The most sensitive man is less sensitive to touch than the least sensitive woman. And people orientation. By age, three baby girls exhibit twice as much eye contact as baby boys. That's by age 3. Flowing from all this, the leadership literature is clear as to the many strengths of what has been broadly termed a female leadership style. Caveating again that I am referring throughout to tendencies, these include pro-social behaviour, women's more marked relationship orientation, stronger social competence, and the panorama view they bring to decisions. They more readily accept ambiguity, are more inherently flexible, and honour intuition as well as pure rationality, something I've always wondered at extraordinarily, seeing the female intuition and how correct it is. Women more commonly try to take everything and everyone into consideration, and their strong social competence allows them to collect information from all sides and consider all perspectives of a situation. It can also give them titanic powers of persuasion, which I say ruefully from experience. Many sectors of the 21st century economic community urgently need the natural talents of women, a capacity to read non-verbal cues, emotional sensitivity, empathy, greater patience, an ability to do and think several things simultaneously, a penchant for long-term planning, and a preference for cooperating and reaching consensus. Harvard psychologist Carol Gillingham, classic study, found that women want to connect. Whilst men are self-oriented, women are other-oriented. Men are rights-oriented, women are responsibility-oriented. Men have an individual perspective where the core unit is me. Women have group perspective where the core unit is we. Men take pride in self-reliance. Women take pride in team accomplishment. They focus naturally on empowerment rather than on power. The business guru Tom Peters describes how we haven't advanced much since the days in the cave. As a hunter, a man needed vision that would allow him to zero in on targets in the distance, whereas a woman needed eyes to allow a wide arc of vision so that she could monitor predators sneaking up to the nest. That is why, he says, modern men can find their way effortlessly to a distant pub, but can never find things in fridge, cupboards and drawers. Women guarded, defended the cave community, whilst the men went out hunting. Men are either switched all the way on, or when in a resting state, only 30% on. Women are never turned off. They are on guard 24/7, and their resting state is 90% on. Men are tuned in or out, seldom in between. I think you get the picture. This is why on International Women's Day we have to and should celebrate women, and we cannot avoid defining who women are or allow them to be stealthily redefined. Women have been called, as we know, recently cervix havers, menstruators, birthing bodies, and perhaps most distastefully, bleeders. Reducing women to their bodily functions is dehumanizing and disgusting. Returning to the definition of women, the dictionary is very clear. A woman is an adult human female. The Equality Act 2010 is also clear. Section 212 states that a woman means a female of any age. This word needs to be politically detoxified so politicians no longer quake when asked to define it. The most high-profile recent examples of this happen to have come from Labour Party's ranks, but politicians across the spectrum are terrified of getting on the wrong side of what is actually just the latest incarnation of misogynist orthodoxy. There is nothing new under the sun. Without being able to use the word woman and understand what we mean by it, women's needs can be obscured and even ignored. But those needs are shared by 51% of the electorate. It came to this because powerful lobby groups and powerful men insist that anyone can be a woman. I'm not a scientist, but I know that humans simply cannot change their sex. And Professor Lord Winston, who is a scientist, said categorically on BBC Question Time, "You cannot change your sex. Your sex actually is there in every single cell in the body. We can change our bodies with hormones and in some cases surgery to more closely resemble the opposite sex, but we shouldn't minimise or soft pedal how difficult this is in practice and how arduous and costly will be the need for ongoing medical intervention." Unsurprisingly, therefore, fewer than 3% of those identifying as transgender women have undergone such modifications, but many who are naturally sympathetic to trans women, and of course trans men, are unaware that the vast majority are still bodily intact. Yet when a female rape victim asks for a woman to examine her, she needs to be sure that her request will be respected, as does one's elderly mother, who requests only female carers provide her with intimate and personal care. Women in these and similar situations who have objected when confronted with a bodily intact man who identifies as a woman have been called bigots and transphobes. Women's prisons can and do contain male-bodied rapists, and newspapers talk about her erect penis when describing sexual assault. Female prisoners can be punished for misgendering the natal intact males in their prison. In sport, women and girls are being beaten and sometimes even injured by bigger, faster and stronger males in their own sports, women's sports. Extreme ideologies are breaking down the social norms, the social contract between male and females. where we make room for each other's needs and respect the sex-based differences I have described. One recognised weakness of women's leaders' pro-social engagement and willingness to see everyone's point of view is abandonment of their own interests. Their tendency to want to share success can mean they doubt their own competence. Women, quite simply, do not always feel able to stand up for themselves. When I've argued for women's rights to single-sex spaces in hospitals and prisons, I have been surprised to receive so many very gentle cards of thank you from those who sign off simply as mothers or ordinary women. The ones who tend to empower others often feel very disempowered in this debate. To return to the need to celebrate women, we cannot do that without an agreed definition and freedom to speak the truth, respectfully but without fear of being cancelled, pilloried or criminalised. There was global condemnation when Russia meted out that treatment to the courageous Russian female journalist Marina Ovsyannikova. She didn't just hold up a sign, she is a sign, and in my contribution today, she has the final word.
My Lords, let me first of all thank Baroness Dedman Scott. I want to thank the Baroness for leading this important debate. I have great affection for her, and it's been wonderful seeing her becoming such a strong and powerful voice on the opposition benches, or on the government benches, but the other side from me. But it shows how, on some issues, we can all come together, I think, very positively to talk about the importance of really addressing the ways in which women's lives are still undermined by misogyny and discrimination, and the ways in which women suffer around the world. Now, I'm a lawyer, and much of my work now is in the international field, and I could have easily made this speech about my work as I see it, day in, day out, in relation to genocide, in relation to sexual crimes in conflict, in relation to the empowering of women as parliamentarians. I chair a group of parliamentarians from the MENA region, and we, under the Helsinki Forum, to help address the legislation they would like to see brought in their own countries, and how that can be done, emulating what happens in other jurisdictions. But today I'm going to speak about the domestic situation. And I want to ask all of you in this chamber, when was the last time you consciously altered your behaviour? When you were at a bus stop or walking home? Now, if you're a man, you might struggle to answer that question, but if you're a woman, you will probably have an example from this week or last week or the one before, or even from yesterday, from last night, going home late at night. The business of self-safeguarding is built into a woman's life from an early age. We listen for footsteps. We avoid the shadows. We carry our keys in our hands. We avoid roads that are ill-lit or that are tree-lined. And when I leave this house and go home late at night, I walk up the middle of the road that leads up to my own house from the tube station, because I don't want to be close to the dark bushes and the shadows that are on the pavement. As children, as young as 8 or 9, girls are warned to take care and to go alone and not to be alone when they're coming back from the park or from school, to keep with their friends, to keep to strict timetables. And the lessons women learn from all of that, internalising of those messages from our parents, are that there are, unfortunately, bad men out there, and we're hearing the message of what they might do to us. And it's about violation, it's about sexual violation, it's the possibility of rape, it's about impregnation. And as little girls, we learn that stuff, and it stays with you for the rest of your life. And the lessons that women learn as they're receiving that care from parents and from their caretakers is that if they don't keep to those steps, that somehow or other it will be their own fault if something goes wrong. And so again, what is internalised is the idea of shame and blame when women find themselves being ill-treated, abused, or assaulted, or even worse. blame often centres on the victim. Now, in 2021, that was last year now, a year ago, the Scottish Government asked me to form an independent working group to decide whether adding sex to existing hate crime legislation would be an effective way to protect women, or whether there should be a standalone remedy to deal with misogyny. And I was clear from the outset that we do not criminalise thought. It's very important that people realise that, you know, when there's talk about this, people say misogyny should be a crime. Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, it cannot be a crime, and I hope we hold true to that, because it's the conduct that flows from hate that we address. Modes of thinking, what happens in that forum internum between our ears, is very precious, and it has to be protected. And freedom of thought is one of the things that is protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in our human rights conventions and in our own human rights law. Freedom of thought is protected because that's where our ideas, our creativity, our imagination, our ability to deal with the world's challenges comes from. And so it has to be protected. But what we don't have to protect are the ills that come from hatred, which of course is also harboured in that space. So I was making it very clear that it's the conduct that flows from hate that we have to address. Soon after we embarked on our task, Sarah Everard and Sabina Nessa were brutally murdered, and women up and down the country demanded that something be done. And women were making the link, and I emphasise it today, they were correctly making the link between serious misogynistic crimes like rape and domestic violence and other serious transgressions that women experience, and then the other things that women experience which are deemed too low level for police attention. And so what women were saying is that if you don't deal with the men who rub themselves up against people on the tube, or the men who flash at women in public places, and little girls, they flash at children from school, the ways in which women are experience abuse, verbal abuse, and touchings and gropings and so on, that if that's not dealt with, then unfortunately you create a normalisation which makes it much more difficult than to address the more serious stuff. The crushing weight of those experiences for women cannot be dismissed as too trivial to engage the law. Now, when I started my legal career, men convicted of rape could often walk out of court. They'd get a suspended sentence. Domestic violence was described as 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. Sexual harassment was laughed at. And I've spent a lot of my energy arguing for reform of gender-based law because it was created from a male perspective, not with conspiracy in mind, but that was the nature of things. A lot has happened, but not enough has changed. And these issues are being treated now much more seriously at policy level, but we're still having difficulty with the outcome. The outcomes still are poor, and you have to ask why. A lot has changed, but the underlying attitudes within the criminal justice system and society as a whole make it very difficult to secure justice for women. So the questions then that my working group addressed in this past year came about by examining testimony of many women and organisations about the verbal insults, the denigration, the humiliation, the gropings, the undermining, the patronising behaviour that they experienced, the trolling online and the objectification sexually. Cumulatively, I have to tell you, it's a horror story. And there's no male experience that is comparable. There really isn't. I know that young men experience violence in the streets and so forth, but it's very different. Men don't come out of the pub saying, "Text me when you get home, Charlie," because they're getting home might pose a serious problem. But women do it all the time, and young women, it's their daily practice. And as a result, we've proposed that there should be a new Misogyny and Criminal Justice Scotland Act created that will include a new statutory misogyny aggravation, which we in this House voted for, but unfortunately was rejected when it went to the other place. But we really should be looking seriously at what women experience. What we have advocated is law for women, challenging the default position that, you know, all law is neutral. Now, that isn't working. Women are being targeted for certain kinds of behaviours, and you need targeted law to deal with it. And so the default position that, you know, men can be raped too, and men can suffer domestic violence too. Men are not experiencing this stuff of standing at a bus stop where if man comes up and starts engaging with you and you ignore him, then you start receiving the most foul torrents of abuse that men just have no idea what women put up with, and talk in the most salacious and disgusting kind, and in language that would make your hair curl. And what I do believe is that the internet has created a disinhibition so that people can say things anonymously and so on, but it's now travelling off the internet. It's now travelling out of social media onto the streets. And young women are receiving this, and in playgrounds, and in the student unions, and in bars, and in clubs. And there's talk of sexual matters in the most explicit and crude and horrible ways. And then, when women are rejecting of it, discussing how unattractive the women are, how they're fat and ugly and therefore wouldn't deserve even any sexual interest in them. And then they go home feeling wretched and miserable. And is it any wonder that they then don't feel able to ask for equal pay, don't ask for promotion at work, don't take up positions in public life? Is it any wonder that they don't make a success in many of the areas where they should be making a success of themselves? And so, I mean, it really is something that has to be addressed. We've actually advocated that there should be a stirring up of hatred against women offence that is introduced into law, that public misogynistic harassment should be made a crime, and that the issuing of threats or invoking of rape or disfigurement online and offline should be criminalised. And I say invoking because what often happens is that the algorithms online create pile-ons so that a woman who might be a member of parliament, a journalist or a campaigner, receives a threat to rape in language that is difficult for the police to deal with, because it says something like, somebody should rape you. You deserve to be raped. So they're not saying, I'm coming after you. They're saying, somebody should rape you. But the terror that's created in the hearts of women is still the same, because they know that there are people who are out there who are likely to take up that sort of invitation. And therefore they start themselves not going out as often, not participating in public events in the way that they might. And so I don't think an older age group of people understand what is going on. I don't think that men have any idea that this goes on. And I think it's really important, if you were to look at the stuff that we looked at as we took evidence, and I don't do social media, and I'm glad that I don't. Poor Lord Farmer's going to receive a whole lot of communications as a result of his speech today. But I don't do that because I take part in too many other things that I know will incite the aggressions of folk out there. But all I can say is that when you're required to do it, gathering evidence, it is a shock to the system to see what people are exposed to. Women in Parliament, women who are standing for Parliament, women who are journalists, women who are campaigners, and even, I was the other day with the scientists who took part in the COVID matter, absolutely poured over them horrible abuse and insult. And then I heard that the woman, the mother of the child who died of a terrible asthmatic attack, who's been campaigning on reducing pollution levels, she too has received abuse online. It's unbelievable that any woman who seems to say anything publicly has this happen to her. So I hope that the UK government will look at what's happening in Scotland, look at the steps that Scotland is going to take, and recognise, and I say to Lord Farmer, it's very nice to hear a paean of praise about women, but the real thing is that we need to be bringing up our boys better, to have some of those things, to have some of those attributes that you're giving to women about sensitivity, about caring, about thinking about the other. Because our boys, I'm afraid, are now seeing this porn. It comes up on their phones willy-nilly, and they are presenting it to girls. They think that intimacy looks like that. They think that that's how you perform sexually. And they are now introducing that kind of thinking into their own behaviours. So this is serious stuff, and I hope that the Westminster government will at some point follow Scotland's lead, and I do hope that we will make the change that is necessary, because most decent men do not behave like this. Most decent men here in this House are willing to be our allies in creating a gear shift. But we have to start looking at the perpetrator and get off this business of examining the women. Let's look at the perpetrators who are doing this and start dealing with these crimes in a different way.
My Lords, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to commend many women in dire situations who exhibit inspirational courage, resourcefulness and resilience. I'm also grateful for the opportunity to make requests to our government to provide urgently needed support for some priority areas. My small NGO, Heart Humanitarian Aid Relief Trust, was founded to provide aid and advocacy for victims of war, conflict, oppression and or persecution, not reached by major aid organisations for political and or security reasons. We work with local partners who use the very limited resources we can provide to make transformational changes for their communities. Time only allows 2 examples of situations where we are privileged to provide such support. Shan Women's Action Network, SWAN, in Myanmar's Shan State, and Central Belt, Nigeria, where the massacres by Islamist Fulani militants continue unabated. And I must say I'm very grateful to the Noble Order of Poets of Tweed for highlighting the very serious situation in South Sudan. We also do support partners there, and the situation is dire, as you highlighted. In Burma, and I use this name because it is strongly preferred by our in-country partners, in Burma, in healthcare, there is currently chaos as a result of the military coup and brutal military offensives against civilians. I visited Shan State in Burma many times with Heart. As we speak today, its people are trapped in protracted conflict, ruthlessly suppressed by the military regime. Among the thousands of displaced, 70% are women and children, including pregnant women, teenagers who've just given birth, and the elderly. They have fled with minimum possessions. Some have lost their farmland, their homes, forced to flee to remote villages or into the jungle. And they are suffering from hunger, cold, lacking shelter and medical care. It's within this context that Heart's inspirational partner, SWAN, continues to operate. SWAN is a female-led organisation dedicated to gender equality and justice. Staff provide life-saving emergency aid, antenatal care, postnatal care and counselling. They also run safe houses for women and girls affected by domestic violence and provide vocational training sessions for practical support in an emergency. My Lords, without organisations like SWAN, many more female lives would be lost. Yet SWAN received no support from within Burma and almost no international support other than from small organisations like Heart. I also raise another serious issue faced by health workers in many parts of Burma. In a recent Zoom call arranged by the Tropical Health and Education Trust, I was privileged to talk to nurses inside Burma who are desperate for supplies needed to provide health care. Many hospitals are now owned by the military, and attacks on civilians have caused many deaths, injuries and massive displacement. So there is an urgent need for healthcare workers who, in spite of personal danger, are striving to provide health care for sick and vulnerable people. Many have been arrested, some are being killed, and many more are living in dire conditions, working without funding or essential equipment. I understand and greatly appreciate that FCDO has been providing some funding, but I also understand that this funding for nurses is going to stop. My Lords, in reality it is even more needed as the situation deteriorates and the impact of COVID becomes more serious. So I really would highlight that very serious problem. Because, my Lords, any reduction or cessation of UK support for the Burmese nursing profession would create even more massive problems in the provision of healthcare, especially in remote regions. For example, there have been reports of hundreds of thousands of women deprived of care during childbirth, which they would have received before the disruption inflicted by the military coup. And this has led to a large increase in maternal and infant deaths. Also, the effective treatment of most common conditions, for example, dengue and pneumonia, has become almost impossible, leading to great suffering and many more deaths. Therefore, may I urge the FCDO to consider as a matter of urgency the provision of significant funding for Burmese healthcare professionals, and highlight in particular in this context nurses. May I also urge implementation of a policy of working with reliable agencies across national borders to reach those in dire need in remote areas who will not receive aid sent to Yangon. For example, in the past, DFID, as it was then, provided cross-border life-saving aid to Swan. DFID also enabled HEART to supply life-saving funds to civilians in Chin State who were suffering from mortar famine, which was caused by the flowering of bamboo, which attracts a massive invasion of rats who devour all food supplies. I just mention these examples to highlight the fact that we do have well-established relationships with health professionals in-country and across borders who have demonstrated integrity and professionalism. They are now all desperate for funding to provide life-saving supplies to some of the many thousands of the displaced people driven from their homes by the military offensives and living in terrible conditions in remote jungle areas. Please, may I therefore make a passionate plea to the government to provide life-saving cross-border aid to reach such civilians living in dire need. As I've said, these people will not receive aid sent to Yangon. I turn now briefly to the Middle Belt region of Nigeria, where tens of thousands have been killed or wounded in horrific Islamist attacks, and where millions are displaced. I've just returned a few days ago from a visit to some of the worst affected regions and witnessed the ruins of homes, farmland, food stores, churches, and an orphanage, all attacked by Islamist Fulani militia in the past 7 months. We heard detailed accounts of children slaughtered, a 90-year-old woman burned alive, and people hacked by machetes to death as they ran from gunfire. Islamist Fulani militia attacks continue to escalate against the predominantly Christian villages in Nigeria's Middle Belt. Thousands of killings have occurred since 2009, with countless others suffering life-changing injuries. Millions are displaced. It's estimated that about 3 million in Central Belt alone are displaced by destruction of their homes, insecurity and fear. And many Muslims who refuse to adopt the Islamist ideology of Boko Haram and Islamist Fulani militia are also killed. According to Christian Solidarity International, at least 615 people were killed just in the first 3 weeks of this year by Islamist militants. The number has increased greatly since then, as killings were continuing during our time there. Perpetration of atrocities also continues. Just a tiny proportion of examples. A widow called Beatrice, aged 25, from Plateau State, told us, I quote, "I returned in the morning, but everything was burned. I went to my home and saw my mother and siblings butchered and burnt." A young mother called Ruth shared a similar story, I quote, "Fulani militia burnt everything, including animals. Hardly anything survived. 10 people were killed. Some were burnt, others shot, others macheted." And Janet, a mother of 4 children, told me, I quote, "I found my husband had been killed. I cannot go back to my village. It has been burnt. We can barely survive." While Nigeria represents 2.4% of the world's population, it contributes to 10% of global deaths for pregnant mothers and has the 4th highest maternal mortality rate in the world. Their suffering is impossible to fathom, but so too is their courage and resilience. I'll give just one example. During many visits to central Nigeria, I've been privileged to witness the phenomenal work of Gloria Kwashi, who is married to the equally inspiring Anglican Archbishop Ben Kwashi of Jos. They're both survivors of horrific Islamist torture and violence. But Gloria's enormous capacity for resilience and love is shown by her ever-expanding family. In addition to her own children, she and Archbishop Ben have adopted 57 orphans in need of care. She also runs a clinic and a school which is established for about 400 children, and she gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning every day to prepare food for the hundreds of students. Makes me feel very humble. Yet, like so many others in central Nigeria, she receives no support. Despite the escalating needs in the Middle Belt region, the United Kingdom does not provide any humanitarian assistance, apart from a small interfaith mediation programme. Such a minimal response from the British government is no way appropriate to the scale and urgency of the humanitarian and security crises in central Nigeria. HEART is responding to desperate requests to help with provision of education and healthcare by supporting the provision of vehicles which take education supplies to the displaced people forced to flee to remote areas. And it will, very soon, be providing similar vehicles to take healthcare to those destitute civilians. Therefore, as I conclude, while I commend the Government for its expressions of commitment to empower women and girls and to prevent violence against them, can I urge the Noble Lady the Minister no longer to turn a deaf ear to the massive suffering of victims of violence in Burma's ethnic states and Nigeria's Middle Belt. There is an urgent need for immediate humanitarian response to enable women to receive the aid they need and also to maintain the inspirational contributions of so many valiant women working to alleviate suffering and to promote human rights, freedom, democracy and peace. They are an inspiration and they always make me feel very humble.
And you're an inspiration too.
I'm very pleased to be taking part in today's debate, and like many others, I'm very pleased that Baroness Steadman-Scott opened the debate in such a comprehensive way. I certainly don't envy her, however, in responding to the debate, which has been already so wide-ranging, my lords. Now, my lords, I do take part today with a somewhat heavy heart, partly because I see the suffering of the women in Ukraine who have to bear such a heavy burden in facing the onslaught of a vicious Russian invasion, whether they stay or flee their homeland. But I too, like the Noble Lord Farmer, salute the courage of Russian TV news editor Marina Olsvyakonikova and, of course, celebrate the wonderful news of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe coming home. And I celebrate the growing recognition, too, of the achievements of women in the digital policy space, which I speak on frequently. But, my lords, more broadly, contrary to expectations, there has been a deterioration in women's rights and condition in this country, in many ways. I was a teenager in the 60s, and it seemed then that growing equality of treatment in all walks of life and respect for women's rights would lead to a better society. In so many areas, I fear this is not the case. As Refuge say in their briefing, women and girls in the UK continue to face appalling levels of violence. More than 1 in 4 women in England and Wales, aged 16 to 74, experience domestic abuse at some point in their lives, and an average of 2 women a week are killed by their partner or ex-partner, a statistic which has not changed in decades. Women's Aid highlight the fact that 60 to 70% of women accessing mental health services have experienced domestic abuse. As Refuge also say, technology is increasingly being weaponized by perpetrators of domestic abuse to harass, stalk and abuse survivors. Technology-facilitated domestic abuse or tech abuse has a devastating impact on both mental health and physical safety. Today's online safety bill, published today, will be judged not only whether it protects children, but also women from this kind of abuse. And then rape charges and convictions are at a minuscule level. Home Office crime figures show 56,152 alleged rapes in the year to September 2020, but analysis showed just 1.5% of reported cases produced a charge. The Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, Dame Vera Baird, said, "If you're raped in Britain today, your chances of seeing justice are slim. Even though police are now referring more and more cases to the CPS, we have seen a catastrophic fall in rape convictions. The latest data," she went on, "shows just 1.5% of cases result in a charge. That means that more than 98% of cases do not reach court. This is shameful and has a real and profound consequence for victims up and down the country." And, my lords, the drop in prosecutions has led to fewer convictions. There were 1,074 rapists convicted in the year to December 2020, a record low and a decline of 64% from the 2,991 convictions in 2016. In criminal justice, we've had equivocation about the status of misogynistic abuse and misogynistic conduct as a criminal offence, as we heard so cogently from the Noble Baroness Kennedy. In healthcare, the forward of Dame Claire Gerarda to public policy projects, a women's health agenda, redressing the balance, is damning. She says, "It is my personal feeling that women have no more rights regarding their bodies and healthcare than when I was born 62 years ago. As a GP of over 40 years, I've treated thousands of women, However, throughout the process of crafting this report, I've been shocked to learn that many of the medical interventions and procedures held up by institutions and policymakers are not in place for the good of women's health, but serve to prevent women from being in control of their own bodies. Single-sex wards are under threat, as we have discussed during the passage of the health bill last night. My Lords, as a Clapham resident, I was shocked by the policing of the Sarah Everard vigil, the complacency of the outgoing Commissioner and the report of the Police Inspectorate. And I'm pleased by the outcome of the recent High Court case brought by the organisers Jessica Lee, Anna Burley, Henna Shah and Jamie Klingler. And all that brings me, my Lords, onto freedom of speech, which is meant to be so dear to us in this country, and in particular my own party, and which has given the publication today of the online safety bill and the response to the Joint Select Committee on which I sat, which is highly topical. My Lords, I've never been trolled or piled on, my Lords, but when I see those who engage in legitimate discussion of sex-based rights, such as Kathleen Stock, Maya Forstater, J.K. Rowling and Baroness Faulkner, and others in my own party, cancelled or insulted or moderated out, then I despair. Where does this lead? Can we, for instance, not talk about the concerns raised by the Cass Review, the Independent Review of Gender Identity Services for Children and Young People, for fear of giving offence? My Lords, a few facts from Cass which we must talk about. The number of children and young people being referred to GIDS has increased dramatically in just over a decade, from approximately 50 referrals per year in 2009 to 2,500 in 2020, with a waiting list of 4,600. And the large majority of these referrals, my Lords, are now for what are called birth-registered females in the report, presenting in their early teens. In 2009, girls made up 1/3 of referrals to GIDS. In 2016, they made up over 2/3. My Lords, I've long worked in the autism field, and it is notable that around 1/3 of the children and young people referred to GIDS have autism or other types of neurodiversity. In the population as a whole, the percentage of people with autism is approximately 1%. My Lords, if we're going to be able to genuinely celebrate women's achievements and advance their rights, then it is vital that we're able to hold a conversation that is civilised and respectful. But we must all be allowed to express our genuine beliefs, or indeed facts, without fear of censorship or abuse.
It's a real pleasure to follow so many impressive women speakers here today, and the supportive comments of men. International Women's Day is a celebration, but it's also a time to assess our progress in protecting the equalities of women. When we look back over the past year, many of us have been left shaken and distressed. The murder of Sarah Everard and the behaviour of police officers supposedly protecting the bodies of Nicole Smallman and Bibba Henry were bad enough. But the subsequent investigations revealed that a large number of police officers held deeply troubling attitudes towards women. It has left the impression that significant numbers of serving police officers have, at the very least, a lack of respect for women in general and their women colleagues in particular, and at worst, a degree of hatred of women that's frightening. When I've spoken on similar issues in the House, some members thought that Scotland was in advance of England and Wales in the way it deals with serious sexual assault and rape. Unfortunately, as Lord Purvis and Baroness Kennedy can probably confirm, this isn't always the case. As in other police forces in the UK, there is clear evidence that Police Scotland has misogynist and sexual predators in its ranks. It has failed to protect women police officers and members of the public from some officers' behaviour. A recent employment tribunal found evidence of a sexist culture in the force which left women officers scared to complain in case they would be left unsupported by male officers when put in dangerous situations. The culture is exposed further by the evidence that over 100 officers face charges of sexual misconduct, including sexual assault against members of the public. These are the very people they were supposed to protect. It's hard not to conclude that this culture would deter women who need to report rape or sexual assault. 2 additional barriers exist in Scotland that put women and men off reporting such assaults. The first is the legal requirement for corroboration under Scots law. This requirement remains in place despite the inquiry in 2011 which recommended its abolition. The report found that 58% of serious sexual offences that were not pursued due to lack of corroboration would have had a reasonable prospect of conviction in England and Wales. The second additional barrier is the use of the not proven verdict, which is unsatisfactory for everyone concerned. It may allow the accused to escape conviction, but it implies that they may have been guilty. The complainer may have to watch someone who they think is a threat to their future safety walk away. Not proven is used disproportionately in rape cases. Rape Crisis Scotland pointed out that nearly 30% of acquittals in rape and attempted rape cases were not proven, compared with 17% for all the total crimes and offences. In March 2021, the Scottish Cross-Justice Review Group produced its final report, Improving the Management of Sexual Offence Cases. It made significant recommendations for a new approach to cases involving serious sexual offences. It proposed that everyone involved in such cases has sufficient understanding of the crimes involved and the potential impact on complainants. Its main recommendation is for a new national specialist court with trauma-informed procedures to deal with serious sexual offence cases. The judges, the prosecutors and the defence lawyers and other court officials would have trauma-informed training. The review further suggests the increased use of commissions for taking evidence. It states that, quote, "It's unquestionable that if complainers' evidence, including cross-examination, were captured at an early stage as possible, much of the trauma arising from the whole process would be diminished. The timescale for the complainer's direct involvement would be greatly compressed and the traumatic effect considerably alleviated. The benefits are such that it cannot be disputed that this is a change which must be made as soon as possible." End quote. A third proposal for consideration was that sexual offence complainers should have independent legal representation. This recognises the potential tension between the interests of the complainer and those of the Crown. The low level of rape cases that go to trial and the very low rate of convictions show that serious sexual offences are different to most other criminal cases. At every turn, problems arise that stop a fair trial. These recommendations offer a different approach. I hope the Minister can recommend this report to the relevant department for England and Wales. For my own part, I hope the Scottish Government which has welcomed the report, will be soon taking action on it.
My Lords, I speak today from the perspective of a retired male lawyer, pale and perhaps a little stale. I shall look at where we have come from, where we have got to today, because history is important. I start with the Matrimonial Causes Act, 1857. Under this, men, for the first time, could petition the court for a divorce on the basis of their wife's adultery. But a wife wanting to divorce her husband had to prove not just his adultery, but an aggravating factor such as rape or incest. That imbalance continued until the Matrimonial Causes Act 1923, which put husbands and wives on an equal footing, each now able to divorce the other on the grounds of simple adultery. Women's property rights had picked up, that is, for those who had some property, when in 1882 the Married Women's Property Act allowed married women to own and control property in their own right for the first time. That was, for some at least, a big step forward. Let me turn to suffrage. Things kicked off in the late 1880s when a woman who fulfilled the necessary property qualifications was permitted to vote in the new London County Council elections. I have a particular interest in this. My great-great-grandmother, the first Lady Sandhurst, by then a widow, questioned why, if she could vote, she could not be a candidate. So, in 1889, she stood in the London County Council elections, in the Liberal interest, I fear, in the Brixton seat. She won. She won the popular vote. But her defeated and cross Conservative opponent challenged her election in the courts. He argued that while the statute gave her the right to vote, it only spoke of men as elected members. That argument succeeded, and she was disqualified. She was not deterred. In 1890, she was elected president of the Society for Promoting the Return of Women as County Councillors. She would have been very proud of my aunt, her great-granddaughter, who became a county councillor and later chairman of Oxfordshire County Council. While the right to vote in general elections was given to women, as we all know, after the First World War, of course there was still discrimination against women because they could not vote until they attained the age of 30. Only in 1928 was that limitation removed. At much the same time, in 1921, we had the Sex Disqualification Act, Removal Act. This enabled women to read for the bar. Helena Florence Normanton was the first woman to take advantage of that act and to join an Inn of Court. In November 1922, she was the second woman to be called to the bar of England and Wales, following the example of Ivy Williams in May 1922. Progress for the women at first was slow, but after the war it got a bit better. In 1949, Normanton and Rose Heilbronn both took silk. The next year, in 1950, Elizabeth Lane took silk. Lane was to be appointed the first woman County Court judge in 1962, and 3 years later was appointed the first woman in the family division of the High Court. I appeared quite often before her, and she was a jolly good judge. Now we have women judges at all levels, at the very highest levels too, even if they're still outnumbered by men. Turning to a personal level now, when I joined my chambers of, I think, 15 or 16 men in 1973, it had no women members. There were by now, of course, growing numbers of women at the bar. A contemporary of mine was Heather Hallett, now Baroness Hallett. Women undoubtedly, as Baroness Kennedy will know, needed grit and luck to start at the bar, then even more than the men, much more. In 1977, we selected the first woman member of my chambers. The initial discussions, I recall well. They revolved really around two things. One, the lavatory facilities, and two, would she leave to have children? But we overcame that barrier, and thereafter, at least in my chambers, a candidate's sex was never an issue. We recruited many more women, although I acknowledge that I cannot say the same throughout the bar. We also learned, in my chambers, to treat women with respect, not to expect them to join in and enjoy so-called banter. Happily, as I speak today, my old chambers currently has 6 women's QCs, Queen's Counsel, and a substantial number of women members. 2 former women members now sit on the High Court bench, and one of them, Philippa Whipple, will this afternoon be sworn in as a Lady Justice of Appeal. So we make progress. We have come a long way. But when I look at the wider world, there is still much to be done. Childcare is hugely expensive. In most, if not all families, the burden of running the home still falls more heavily on women. I know, I have a working daughter. The large numbers of women graduates and the growth of working from home will perhaps see the balance change over time and male partners take a greater share. I certainly hope so. But to my mind, as we've heard from others today, even more serious than opportunities at work are the incidents of daily life that women have to put up with. Yesterday's news, the business pages of the BBC News on the web, saw as the lead item that Lloyd's of London had fined a member firm £1 million. It had fined them because Atrium underwriters had admitted charges relating to bullying and misconduct during annual boys' nights out. These included initiation games, heavy drinking, and the making of inappropriate and sexualized comments about female colleagues. That was yesterday. So we men have much to learn. We must all do better, but the worst part of this laddish culture is that the disrespect for women, as we have heard, and the plain misogyny at its heart, is not just unpleasant for women and demeaning, but it leads to violence. This is not getting better. I looked at the figures for London crime. In 2010-11, there were some 3,300 rape offences recorded. 10 years later, 2019-20, that figure had more than doubled to 7,890. And as we all know, only too well, women are afraid to walk home at night alone. I could go on. Very simply, until we men, and I'm not perfect myself, all treat all women with respect and decency, these numbers will not improve. More generally, too many women are demeaned. And that is why, for my part, I'm very sorry to see the pressure from some in the transgender debate. In arguing for rights, some advocates pour scorn on women who wish to preserve privacy and personal modesty. Women should not have to give up hard-won rights before they've even got true, effective equality with men. We have come a long way, but we have a long way still to go. We can and must do better. Women must not come second. Thank you.
My Lords, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this International Widows' Day debate, as I have done every year in the last decade, on the topic of women's equality in this country and around the world. It is a critical time because the impact of inequality is always worse in times of conflict and hardship. And so I will focus my remarks on the plight of women fleeing war in Ukraine. We must pray for all those left behind in Ukraine to face the pitiless Russian forces, the old and infirm who won't or can't leave their homes, the men and boys who are forbidden to leave with their families and left to fight the invader. But my concern today is with the Ukrainian mothers who have had to flee with their children, not knowing when or whether their families will be united once more. We know this category forms the majority of refugees from Ukraine at this stage. For now, and in many cases perhaps forever, these are single-headed households, and as such, they face a double whammy. The inequality of the refugee navigating the many obstacles placed in their way as they seek refuge, as we have seen in recent weeks. And the inequality of the single mother who must not only be there for her children, but also put food on the table, clothe them, ensure they can go to school and receive medical care. All this while they themselves have to deal with and all too often hide their own trauma from what they have experienced and their fears for the partners and parents they have left behind. It reminds us that ensuring the equality of women requires us all to take positive action. It is not a matter of ticking boxes. It is not a matter of theoretical rights. Equality requires us to take the trouble to see the reality of how others live, to see it and respond with the humanity and generosity that we are so quick to claim but so slow to dispense. My Lords, I will not dwell on the delays we have seen in living up to our promises of generosity, but instead focus on what we can and should do to help these mothers in their hour of need. The community's secretary last weekend said, "We will put our arms around them and give them all the support they need." That is welcome. He also said the first arrivals under the new scheme could be expected this weekend. So let us do all we can to ensure that the support available to these wretched people and to the British families opening their homes to them is fit for purpose. It is not just a matter of welcoming these single mothers and refugees. We can do better than that. we can see they are doubly disadvantaged and do something about it. The Lumba Foundation, which I chair, is planning an association with Rotary International worldwide and with Rotary International in the UK and Ireland to raise funds in support of Ukrainian mothers fleeing with their dependent children. We will draw on the Lumba Foundation's extensive experience of the plight of widows, including those widowed in conflict and natural disasters, who all too often face that same double whammy of a sudden change in their status with an increased responsibility for their dependents. The mothers and children fleeing from Ukraine are in that situation, and we know what it takes to, as the community secretary put it, give them all the support they need. My plea to the government today is to do more than matchmaking and providing sums of money to host families and local authorities, essential as these are, but to make sure the dots are connected across national and local government to offer the tailored and joint-up support for these refugees by, number one, identifying the likely needs from counseling and health to schooling and economic empowerment, and to facilitate a multi-agency response. Secondly, reaching out to mothers arriving with their children and telling them about the special support that is available. Finally, setting up a special helpline they can contact for advice. Women's inequality has all too often been invisible and ignored. Yet the irony is that it is women who are the first emergency service, the people we rely on to look after the children and to care for their elderly and vulnerable. Making women's equality real means understanding and dealing with the barriers they face. That is an investment that always pays off. Thank you.
Wonderful.
My Lords, I rise beginning with the good news of very much welcoming the return of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Azuri, and acknowledging that they were victims of geopolitics in which they played no part, as indeed are the women, girls, men and boys in Ukraine. But, of course, it's important on a day like today, in a debate like today, that we look around us. And the Noble Lord Purvis looked at the situation ranged across the political parties. He did leave one out, however, which I'm very proud to say currently has 100% female parliamentary representation. And like the Liberal Democrats, we're looking to greatly grow our representation. And I'm sure there'll be some men in the next tranche, but I'm hopeful that we can still keep the percentage of females very high. But I do want to associate myself with the remarks of the Noble Lady Baroness Gale in commenting on both the location and the timing of this debate. I don't know how many people have looked up and thought that we are conducting this debate at the feet of the patriarch. There could hardly be a less appropriate place for today's debate. Now, I often, when I'm speaking in your Lordship's House, seek to share the words of women of today who are less privileged, who don't have access to the chambers, who don't have a voice in front of us. Today, as we speak in the midst of a building filled with the portraits and statues of largely dead, white, rich males, I'm going to seek to allow voices from the past, voices of women, to be heard in your Lordship's chamber. As the noble lady Baroness Hodgson said, there's been a conspiracy of silence. And if we look at history, the words, the voices of women right through history have so often been suppressed. And I want to bring a few of those to your Lordship's house today and see what we can learn from their courage, their determination and their achievements. I'm going to start by looking at the issue of tackling, calling out violence. Now, the noble lady Baroness Kennedy of the Shores very powerfully spoke about the risks women face today as they've always faced outside the home. But of course we know today and in the past the greatest risks of violence against women are inside the home. So I'm going to quote the 15th century Italian poet and author of the Book of the City of Ladies, Christine de Pizan. And she wrote, I quote, "How many women are there who, because of their husband's harshness, spend their weary lives in the bond of marriage in greater suffering than if they were slaves?" Close quote. I'm also going to quote the English legal theorist from the 18th century, Sarah Chapone. Quote, "A man, he may be as despotic, accepting the power over life itself, as the Grand Seigneur in his seraglio, with the difference being only that the English husband has but one vassal to treat according to his variable humour. Whereas the Grand Seigneur having many, it may be supposed that some of them at some times may be suffered in the quiet." We sometimes think that in the past women endured this, were forced to endure, but they always fought back, they always spoke out. And it's really important that we listen in this Women's History Month, as well as this us marking International Women's Day, that our foremothers are there. And I note that the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, talked about how so much of our education, or I think he was talking about other countries' education being male-orientated. But of course that's true of so much of our education system today. I don't know if we went into a school today how many pupils would know of the two authors I've just quoted. And I think looking at the issue of art, there's another woman I wish to quote, which is the Italian Baroque painter Artemisia Gentileschi. And she produced some of the most wonderful art, I would posit, that has ever been created. And she did so after the most awful and difficult origins. She was raped as a young woman in 1612. She was an 18-year-old. She was tortured in court to be forced to prove the honesty of her testimony. Now, Antonio Gentileschi went on to produce wonderful paintings. Among them is perhaps the most famous of a biblical story of Judith slaying Holofernes. What that picture is of Judith with a knife cutting off the head of an enemy while that enemy is held down, she's helped by another woman. I invite your Lordship's house to imagine what it might be like if that painting was up there instead of the one that we have before us. So, and what Artemisia said, one of the quotes from her that come down to us was, "As long as I live, I will have control over my being." What an inspirational phrase that is. Now, I'm also going to look more broadly than the fate of individuals, back to Hypatia, the 5th century Alexandrian philosopher and political advisor. And she, one of the quotes from her that comes down to us is, quote, "Regardless of our colour, our race and religion, we are brothers and sisters." Now, Hypatia was caught. We might think we have culture wars today, but the culture wars between pagans and Christians in 5th century Alexandria were considerably more violent. And indeed, those of you who know the fate of Hypatia will know that her body bore the extreme scars, the cause of her death was that culture war. But she was saying, everyone are brothers and sisters. Let's listen to this wisdom from women of the past. Now, finally, I'm going to come to one final person to quote, much closer to the current day, and that's Wangari Maathai, the Kenyan Nobel Peace Prize winner. And I've got a quote from her. "We are called to assist the earth to heal her wounds, and in the process heal her own. Indeed, embrace the whole of creation in all of its diversity, beauty and wonder." Wangari Maathai was talking about a different kind of model to what's existed not just in past decades or past centuries, but past millennia. And I've gone through women's history in a very fast scan over the past 2 millennia. We have had for those millennia a man-made system. It's given us the world we have today, a world in which people are exploited, particularly but not solely women, in which nature is exploited and destroyed as people too are destroyed. Now, the Noble Lady, the Minister, in opening this debate, spoke about the slogan for this International Women's Day, "Break the bias." Well, I would argue that we need something far more fundamental, as all of those women from history teach us. We need to break the system. The system has failed us. We need a new system with women as the leaders at its heart.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to speak in this debate. I learned quite a lot, and it's also a great pleasure to follow the Noble Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle. I'm glad she referred to education, because my background is from the world of business schools, and the language there is entirely male and aggressive. Accounting and finance is all about domination, control, slicing, control, selling, asset stripping, plundering. Nobody cares if workers at the end of the day are fired and have no home to go to. None of that ever comes into any accounting calculation. Nobody ever considers what the social impact of redundancies is, wage reductions is, tax avoidance is, whereas women are more concerned about nurturing, supporting, growing things. There's a stark difference. And many women who enter the world of business schools are increasingly forced to leave their feminine selves outside and behind, and that is fundamentally wrong. Women need to be valued in their own right, in what they bring, not compared to how they compare to men. And that requires a fundamental thought, and I will hopefully return to that issue on another day in another debate. I note that the resolution as tabled here says that the Grand Committee take note of International Women's Day and United Kingdom's role in furthering and protecting the equality of women. I kept wondering what happened to equity. Where is equity? Equity is very important too. Without equity, many people will never ever attain fairness and equality. In many ways, equity and equality are also elusive. They are always in the process of being made, but they are never really finally made because of many social divisions. Therefore, that requires constant vigilance, constant new approaches, constant search for dealing with social problems. So I would have personally preferred to see equity mentioned there as well. Now, we have a strange kind of a scenario that we have more women in government than ever before, yet the economic progress of women seems to have stalled or is slowing down. That is a kind of a paradox. And I keep wondering whether women in government are increasingly asked or forced, or perhaps unconsciously adopting kind of male objectives rather than female approaches, which I referred earlier to growing, nurturing, supporting, etc. And that, again, requires some issues to be looked at. Life expectancy increasingly is stalled, if not gone into reverse. Life expectancies for women has now declined, according to ONS data, that is at birth, declined from 83.6 years to 82.6 years. And inevitably, it's the poorest women who are most negatively affected. Yet this government is doing incredibly little to reduce poverty. If anything, inequalities have increased. There are more people living in poverty than ever before, 14.5 million even before the pandemic, and the situation is far worse now. The Equal Pay Act of 1970 promised an era of equal pay for equal work, but that has remained elusive. Women's median hourly rate is 10.2% less than men's. And gender pay gap, the last statistic we had from the government for full-time and part-time employees was 15.4%. So why is it that we set ourselves a goal 50 years ago but are yet to reach it? What exactly is the government doing? I know we will hear of many things, government is doing X, Y, Z, but the facts, as indicated by data, do pose the question, has enough been done? Why has enough not been done? We are referring here to women, but of course women are not a homogeneous category. They are differentiated by age, class, disability, ethnicity, and many other social factors. Black women are least likely to be among the UK's top earners. They face the double hit of gender and ethnicity, and that's why I was referring earlier to equity. What can we do to lift them up? So they are the most underrepresented group in the top percentiles of income in the UK. Some progress could be made by mandatory ethnicity pay reporting, but the government is vehemently opposed to that. So it is hard to see how progress on ethnicity pay gap can be made when government accepts the principle of gender pay gap reporting for women, but not on the basis of ethnicity. That again does not help many women, and I hope that the government would revisit it. So low pay for women results in low occupational pensions, contributions, and eventually low pensions, which condemns them and their dependents to poverty and insecurity, especially in later life. So we have 1.25 million people, women, who are retired and are actually living in poverty. The government's response is to cut the triple lock on the state pension, which pushes even more into poverty, and that again is unsatisfactory. The state pension for women is always less than men's, according to the statistics published by DWP. Now, why do they have to be less? Of course, women over the years may have paid less in, but is that the only way we're going to measure somebody's value, that they paid less in, therefore they get out less? Are there no other basis of thinking about it, like humanity, decency, morality, ethics? So the two should really be equalised. The women's state pay, a state pension needs to be lifted up, at least. It should not be less than that given to men. The government publishes all kind of budgets, statements, and we will have a budget statement next week and lots of other legislation, but it is never really accompanied by a gender impact assessment. What is the gender impact assessment of what the government proposes in the budget? We struggle actually to see. I raised this last year, and I got a lot of soothing noises from ministers, and I also raised it at other times in the House, but no development whatsoever. So we now have income tax being hiked by stealth, and national insurance contributions hiked by being increased as well, but there's no gender gap analysis. Who will suffer the most? What about single mothers? Would they really be suffering the most? Possibly yes, but absolutely no attention to that. In his budget statement last October, the Chancellor referred to the word women just once in his speech. But there was not even one gender-specific policy to help women. Not one. Okay? However, there was a policy which would hurt women. And that was the cut in universal credit of £1,040, affecting 4.4 million families. And the government took that £4 billion from the poorest and gave it to the bankers. Okay? So many of the households affected by this are led by single women, single mothers, but no help given to them at all. So they're basically condemned. There is a division, there's a gender division of labour in our society. Many women are confined to low-paid jobs, whether it is teaching, nursing, social care, supermarket, hospitality and other sectors. But the government has actually imposed wage freezes, again hurting women the most in pursuit of its economic objectives, which I never really understood what they are. Okay. So the take-home pay of many women has declined as a result of these austerity policies and wage freezes, and therefore prevented access to nutritious food, good education, healthcare, and other essentials. Again, there is a gender issue here. So we have a paradox here that somebody working in social care or a supermarket, a female worker in a social care or a supermarket, is getting paid and will pay national insurance, extra national insurance at 1.25 percentage point, but a speculator speculating how much economic surplus those individuals would generate will not pay anything from the capital gains made from those speculation. They will not be paying any national insurance, never mind the extra 1.25 percentage point. And who are the winners? Who are these speculators? They are mostly men. At the very least, the government could see that the gains picked up by men through speculation are at least some are shared with women on whose backs somebody is making these speculative gains. Again, I see no analysis, no sensitivity to any of these gender issues in the government policies. So there is no equity or equality of tax treatment of earned and unearned income, and that again has gender consequences because women in low-paid employment are paying taxes at a higher rate than those who are making money through other sources such as dividends or capital gains, which again the analysis shows are predominantly men. Okay? So government policies have condemned many also to use food banks, and again it is women who suffer because they are on low pay. So take just one more example. We have increase in homelessness all around us these days. You can see it as you enter tube stations and many other places. 2/3 of homeless Londoners living in temporary accommodation are women. That is 42,000 women in London alone are homeless. 39% of homeless households living in temporary accommodation in London are headed by a single mother. Many are homeless because of domestic abuse and poverty, or they can't afford to pay rents because their income is low and the tax system doesn't really do much for them. So unaffordable housing is a key factor, and women bear the brunt of the housing policy failures. The living cost crisis, on top of the cuts to universal credit, housing benefit, and the sexist policies like benefit cap, make it much harder for women and their families to keep a roof over their head. The government can help by reversing the damaging welfare cuts and increase all benefits, at least in line with inflation. That would help to reduce homelessness amongst women, single mothers and their children. So by building high-quality homes with rents linked to local wages, not what the landlords want, with the rents linked to local wages, the government can prevent more women from becoming homeless. So I would now say, my lords, let us celebrate this year, and I do hope that the Minister will be able to make some positive promises in return.
My Lord, it's a great pleasure to follow the Lord Sikka. At least I will not feel lonely talking about economics of gender inequality. First of all, let me say that the title does say furthering and promoting the equality of women. And of course, what we're really saying is we're kind of combating inequality and hoping that we will be able to reduce inequality as much as possible. And the central inequality I want to talk about, which is sort of almost eternal, is who does the work. And economists more or less talk about work in terms of paid work. They say, oh, there is work and there is leisure, and how does the individual choose how many hours to work? Of course, that's all very fine, but a lot of work is unpaid work, and most unpaid work is done by women. And we have very little accounting of unpaid work in sort of formal economic analysis, and we have very few policies to deal with unpaid work. Now, I have over a long career in economics explored the idea of citizens' income, basic income as it used to be called. And the argument for basic income for a long time didn't actually deal with the gender issue. The way it was dealt with was that there should be citizens' income available for all voters, and it should be paid sort of without asking any questions. And then, of course, the idea was that, if you pay people just a basic income without work, they'll stop working. And then what will happen? This is entirely an idea about paid work. Because whether you pay basic income or not pay basic income, unpaid work has to be carried on, because society lives on unpaid work. Not only cooking and childcare and nursing and care of the elderly, all sorts of things, cleaning the house, all sorts of things are done by women mainly. And it is a very interesting paradox, well, not paradox, but something to note, that when things like universal credit, when welfare state arrangements are made, there is a great compulsion to say, are you seeking work? Unless you're seeking work, you're not eligible to be paid money when you're out of work. Now, it's very interesting because quite a lot of women may not be able to seek work because the unpaid work demands made on them because of the size of the family and other things may make it difficult for them to qualify for universal credit in a world in which that is a sort of a requirement. So one problem we will have to face is, could we actually fashion a basic income package just for women, or just for anybody who sort of does unpaid work? This is especially very, very important in the discussion on the health and social care bill. Very often it has been mentioned that some social care workers are, as it were, not so much involuntary social care workers, but in a family, the social care burden falls on the woman who is around. And so they are, of course, unpaid. The whole category of unpaid social workers, and we ought to be doing something about unpaid social care workers. So I think one idea would be to create a basic income especially for women. Just as we're talking about citizens' income, this is women's citizens' income. So you have to be of a voting age to be able to accrue, to earn or to receive basic income. And I recently contributed a piece to something called the Palgrave Dictionary of Basic Income with a co-author who was a woman, and she was very much the leading light in this joint work, because she pointed out that basically the distinction between paid and unpaid work is central to the issue of gender inequality. Because unpaid work is non-compensated, women always have inequality of income relative to men. And so one of the, I know there is no money in the government and they want to cut taxes and rather than give money away and so on. But we are about to enter a very difficult economic period in the next I think 5-6 years. We're going to have a stagflation and all those sorts of things. So we will have to take greater care of the vulnerable citizens, and they're mainly women. So I would say, since the Noble Baroness, who is answering for the government, is in charge of giving money away on pensions and all sorts of other things, and we always have to go to her to say, look, give us a bit more. I think she ought to explore, all I can say. I think women ought to be paid something like, say, £50 per day for the weekend. I think it's a weekend bonus. Nothing very much, but only women of a voting age. And I think we ought to experiment with that, because to do that would be an experiment in trying to reduce the inequality gap between men and women of a working age. I think that is about it. I don't think I want to say any more about this than that, because I'm the 17th speaker out of 18. I just wanted to make one remark on what the Noble Lord Farmer said. He mentioned this, the woke controversy going on. And I think it is a very peculiar thing that the debate about what is a woman and who is a woman is very, very interesting. It's a difficult job, because the people who are insisting or questioning the word women and so on are probably as deprived as everybody else. But I think we cannot have the majority suffer because there's a minority which feels itself deprived. So I'm not a lawyer, and this is not a flippant comment. I think we ought to make a distinction of women by birth and women by choice, and men by birth and men by choice. And if that kind of usage would become normal, or at least usual, we're not insulting anybody, but there is a question of choice, and it is symmetric for both sexes. So I think if you could say women by birth and women by choice, then it may be that the noise on this. Sorry.
Please, my dear friend and former economics teacher from the LSE has said, I think probably Noble Lord should not go there, because this is not about choice. People who choose to be gay, people who are gay do not choose to be gay, they are gay. People who believe they are a woman, believe they are a woman. People who believe they are a man, believe they are a man. There is absolutely a debate to be had, but frankly, it's not a choice.
You know, it's not the first time that my proposal has beaten the dust. So and the fact that I taught the Nobel Baroness at makes me proud that she has finally sorted me out. Okay, so that being said, I think I can conclude. Thank you.
Well, I have the unenvious task of being yet one more pale male. It is interesting, and I don't always agree with the Noble Baroness Bennett of Manham Castle, but on many things in her contribution I did. And she certainly, I want to agree with her next year. Don't let us become second-class citizens and have the debate in here. It should be in the chamber. I mean, I really think it's such a bad... the symbolism of it, you know, that somehow it's become a second-class debate. And it'll do. Just put it in the Moses room, which was rightly remarked on one of my ancestors, who wasn't perhaps the most progressive male on the planet, but he was a man of his time. And the other thing, I couldn't help reflect on the Bishop of Durham, that, you know, you fought long and hard to have women bishops, and I do think they've got to mark their calendar. They should be represented. I actually want to return to this last bit of the debate, if only to disagree with my noble friend Baroness Thornton, when she endeavoured to say, well, this is how it is, and you know, we shouldn't go there. Well, Lord Farmer did go there, and he had absolutely every right to go there and assert a view that is held by many, maybe not by the Noble Baroness Thornton, but by many, that there is a biological sex of men and women. All right? No, I'm not. Excuse me. I'm not. I didn't. I'm not going to stop.
She didn't say. Noble lords deserve to be heard in their contribution to the debate.
It's all right. I wasn't going to stop anyway. But thank you. This is an important debate, and on Women's Day it's an issue that deserves to be aired, as the Noble Lord Farmer did. And I wanted to actually draw attention to women that I think have been very strong and willing to undertake expressing a view. And it started with my interest in this debate with J.K. Rowling, who had just had the temerity to suggest that there was a word, and it was women, and that produced an absolute unbelievable uproar. And it was followed by Kathleen Stock, who was lost her job for trying to say the same thing. And interestingly, another woman I admire, who was also mentioned by Lord Farmer, is Baroness Faulkner, who took over a really tough job at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, saying much the same thing, that women's safe spaces should be protected, and that the view that there is such a thing as women, people have to respect that view, which has got nothing to do with saying that we should in any way discriminate against transgender people. It was the Noble Lord Clements who mentioned a very important review, the Cass review that came out recently. And what she discovered was that, although the facts were there, that in the current system, far too many young people are being offered puberty blockers on the basis that they've changed their gender. In fact, 80% of people who present at what was just the Tavistock Clinic with symptoms of gender dysphoria, by the time they reach 18, discover that they're either gay or lesbian, or changing or trying to change their body is not the solution to their problems. And indeed, there was the famous case of Kira Bell, who went to extreme lengths and then realised that, in fact, that wasn't the solution to her problems in life. So these are difficult issues. The importance of the Cass review is that what it's saying is that there should be clinics around the country that there should be much faster treatment for young people, and he mentioned, Noble Lord Clements mentioned young people with autism. I was listening to a group of concerned clinicians recently, and they said the huge impact of social media on young people is one of the biggest single factors that makes young girls believe that somehow they're in the wrong body. And we shouldn't underestimate the impact of social media. I want to go on to talk about, I suppose the older I get, the more I think the women in my life I find are the most interesting, they're inspirational, the women that I've met. And I want to refer to some of them. There was a woman writer that I came across recently, Bernardino Evaristo. What an amazing writer. If you haven't read her, I recommend her. Girl, Women, Other. But even more superb is her autobiography, Manifesto, where it tells you what it's like growing up in a mixed race family in the 60s. Pretty tough. And she did it and fought over the years to establish herself. And I was grateful for Baroness Bennett again, because I'm a lover of Renaissance art, and it was only recent, not that long ago, when I discovered Artemisia Gentileschi, and I realised that there are some wonderful people in the artistic, in the arts. But there's three women that I know that I admire. I chair I chair an advisory committee on a social enterprise, and the CEO who runs it is a woman called Jenny Holloway. She's an absolutely amazing woman. Pays herself very little. She recruits and trains mostly women in Haringey, and they learn how to become machinists. They learn how to cut patterns. They're able to start their own business. She is an amazing woman. She single-handedly decided that when the Laura Ashley factory closed down in Paris, she'd save it. And much against my advice, probably, because I thought it was mission impossible, she's succeeding. And she's opening another training establishment in Leicester to stop mainly women there being exploited in the clothing industry. I've got another couple of women that I know. Ushma Patel, she's really the power behind the throne of the local landlord in my pub. What makes her Ushma interesting is, well, we started to chat one night, and she told me that she'd donated a kidney, and then not long after that had climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Now, I once thought about climbing Mount Kilimanjaro with 2 kidneys, never mind with 1. And so I take my hat off to Ushma, who is an amazing woman. And then another woman that I've come across, surprisingly, my wife does God in our family, as I somewhat irreverently state. But I do go along occasionally on high days and holy days. And once I went along and I listened to a lay minister, Liz Wolferson, in an amazing sermon, and she fascinated me. I learned a bit more about her. Well, Liz is the diocesan director of Church of England schools in London. And she's rescued probably 10 failing schools. She's a tough cookie. She gives the head teachers 6 months, and if they don't improve, she waves goodbye bye to them. But these are, in my opinion, really interesting women. There's many more of them. I was admirer of Kemi Badenoch, who's the Minister for Women in the government. And then, last but by no means least on my list, I'm going to mention the minister there, Baroness Stedman Scott. I didn't know a lot about Debbie. I was interested. And one day we were sitting down talking, and she told me about her life in the Salvation Army, and she educated me about the Salvation Army in a way that I never knew before. She can sing some damn good songs, the Salvation songs as well, but I won't get her to do that here. Well, what I admire about Debbie is, and I checked, she wouldn't mind me saying this, she's out but proud. And that takes a lot of guts to do that. And whatever you think about the policies that she enunciates on behalf of the government, and not everybody will agree with them, nobody can say that Debbie doesn't care. You know, nobody can accuse her of that. I want to hurry up. There was about more women in. You said STEM. I prefer STEAM. Get the arts in there. But it is changing. It is changing. I'm meeting more women in apprenticeships. Interestingly, we had the Industry and Parliament Trust had a dinner, and there were some wonderful women there. There was one young black woman bringing up a disabled child, and she joined as a bus driver. And I said, "What's it like being in a bus carriage? They must be all the rest are men, aren't they?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "The banter?" She said, "It's pretty bad, but I've learned to hold my own." But the manager of the company was there, and I did point out to him that it wasn't her holding her own; it was about him improving the management and the training of that company. But we shouldn't be too despairing about what's happening in this. I met two British Asian young women recently who absolutely staggered me. I asked them what they do, and I stereotyped. I thought, well, they're going to be doctors, lawyers, accountants, whatever. But what would they do? One's a civil engineer and one's a quantity surveyor working on HS2. I said, well, I've got to go and meet your mum and dad because that's fantastic to see that. So we shouldn't despair. The other young woman that I met, an apprentice, was a paralegal, interestingly. And so another route into it. Our attitudes changing? I think they are. People laugh when I say this, but I actually see more men pushing children in buggies than I ever used to do. Now, has it changed fundamentally? No, there's a lot more progress to be made. Of course there is, but men need to be more involved in childcare. Nobody's referred to the impact of the pandemic we've been through. Lots more working from home. Women suddenly beginning to realise, why do I have to commute 5 or 6 days a week? I want more time, especially if I'm going to be involved in the childcare. And I agree with some of what my noble friend Baron Desai said. Single parents, there's been a lot of talk about single parents, and I agree that we want the childcare costs are really very, very important. Too many fathers are still abdicating responsibility, and we don't do enough about that. But do you know what the single most important thing we could do for a single parent family is get somebody into work in that family. That has one of the most profound influences, so that children don't grow up in a family where generation after generation seem to think that they don't need to join the world of work. They do. It's fundamentally important, and the example set to them by the mother being in work is an important example. You can criticise the universal credit, and people frequently do, some because they don't really know much about the system, I have to say. But let me say this to you. First of all, yes, I understand the concern about the £20, but people forget all about the taper change, which actually made quite a difference when people were in work. And secondly, the most staggering achievement of the universal credit system is the digitisation. 6 million extra people were enabled to go onto universal credit during the pandemic. That was an astonishing achievement. And many, many women were able to take advantage of this. I just want to end on one thing, equality of pay. Pay for work of equal value. I look at my son and daughter. I look at Laura, my daughter. I'm really proud of her. She's an advanced clinical practitioner in A&E at Northwick Park Hospital. Been right through the pandemic, and she's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. She's twice as qualified as her brother Paul, and earns half the pay. Why? Because he's in IT, isn't it? And that's the value that we put on them. So I think it's been a fascinating debate, and I want to end on this, because probably it's the woman I admire the most, the one who's puts up with me, Lady Margaret. And she's an amazing woman, a very, very skilled craftswoman, modest about her achievements, etc., brought up the family, mainly in my absence, I think. But, well, I know. But recently I couldn't help saying she's got a very sharp sense of humour. And we were in Marks and Sparks, and we were looking at a bottle of wine. It was quite expensive, and I said to her, "What are we celebrating?" And quick as a flash, she said, "Well, we're still alive." And that's something we all need to celebrate. So I've enjoyed taking part in the debate, and I look forward to Mission Impossible as Baroness Stedman Scott covers the waterfront.
My Lords, I'm also grateful I'm still alive. I would like to thank the noble lady, Baroness Stedman Scott, for introducing this very wide-ranging debate so very comprehensively. And I'm very glad that we have a debate for International Women's Day, though I echo the complaints that have been voiced by my noble friend, Lord Purvis of Tweed, Baroness Gale, Baroness Bennett and others, that it hasn't been close to the day itself or in the chamber. And I do pay tribute to the Conservative peers who successfully put pressure on their leadership, who had no plan to schedule this. The wonderful lady, Baroness Gale, played a key part years ago in making sure that we would hold this debate. And I hope you will forgive my absence for a while to contribute in the statement on the release of the Iranian retainees. It's hugely welcome that Nazanin and Anousheh are now back home. And of course, as the noble lady, Baroness Stedman Scott, noted in the context of this debate, it's wonderful to welcome Nazanin back, caught up as she was, and as so many other women are, by events beyond their control. And I'm grateful to my noble friend, Lord Purvis, not only for his outstanding speech, but also for taking a full note of the speeches that I missed. Of course, had we been in the chamber, I would not have had this conflict. We know that there is no country in the world yet where there is gender equality. We know that the Scandinavian countries lead in this regard, and we also know that the least developed countries see the greatest gap between the genders. That's where it is most stark. And as I listened to the noble lady Baroness Gale, I had a sense of déjà vu, and no doubt the noble lady Baroness Thornton will as well. The same questions remain unanswered since those first debates in your lordship's house. And the wonderful team that I see arrayed behind the minister should be well prepared. They and their forebears will have been passing the same notes to the minister year in and year out. Why haven't we, for example, raised by the noble lady, ratified the Istanbul Convention? Why does GEO move from department to department inadequately supported? When will our parliaments reach gender parity? Why aren't we centrally addressing the position of women in the UK, let alone overseas? They are all so familiar. So what's happened since we last debated the position of women in the United Kingdom and the wider world? In the UK, as worldwide, the pandemic has hit women harder than men, even though the disease itself may not discriminate. And the point about how it's hit women harder was picked up by the noble Baroness Lady Armstrong. So why is that so in the United Kingdom? It's the same reasons as apply elsewhere. Women are more likely to have been working in sectors that were disrupted, more likely to have to care for children, more likely to have to homeschool them, more likely to have responsibility for elderly relatives. All of this means the pandemic has hit them harder. We know too, as noble lords have mentioned, that domestic violence rose and that there were fewer resources available to assist women in that circumstance. And Women's Aid has noted that around 2/3 of women seeking access to health services, mental health services, which themselves are scarce,
have suffered domestic abuse. And they point out gender inequality is both a cause and a consequence of violence against women and girls, the sharpest end of women's disadvantage both in this country and worldwide. And my noble friend, Lord Clement Jones, has highlighted the appalling situation that we're now in terms of holding people to account over violence against women and girls, and a number of other noble lords mentioned this. And it's appalling to see the awful trolling of women online, which he mentioned. So many women MPs receive death threats, and how could we encourage our daughters to come into politics today? And the noble lady, Lady Kennedy, has urged that we move forward urgently in this area, and she has a remarkable record in this. And she's pointing to the proposed new Misogyny Criminal Justice Act in Scotland. And we've been debating that for England, and it's been pushed back. And the noble Lady Baroness Bryan points to the lack of progress in Scotland. And so now, as we come out of the pandemic, theoretically, we face the economic consequences. And as the noble Lord Seeker and Lord Desai and others have indicated, unless you have economic equality, you won't have any other form of equality. The government warns of constrained budgets despite hugely rising fuel costs and inflation hitting the price of food and clothes. Again, this hits the poorest the hardest, as we've heard, and women are, on average, poorer than men. The noble Lord Seeker and the noble Lord, the Bishop of Durham, pointed to the way in which women are terribly disadvantaged economically, and including in the extraordinary restrictions on universal credit for families beyond 2 children. As the noble Lord Sandhurst, in his fascinating speech, rightly noted, women still carry the greater burden of caring. And as we look internationally, we know that the situation can be dire for many women and girls around the world. As we know, in theory, almost as many girls are now in school as boys, which is welcome, but in reality, the level and quality of schooling differs. The boys are in better schools and in school for longer, with the enhanced life chances this brings. How, therefore, will the government deliver the global education commitments made in 2021? We've heard about the 58% gap in economic participation and opportunity and the gigantic gap in political empowerment. And in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, what do? We cut aid. And here I really must endorse the speech by my colleague, noble Lord Purvis of Tweed, and his castigation of the government over its cut in aid. It's all very well saying the same things which we hear year in and year out, that we support women and girls internationally, we are supporting education and so on. And no country has gender equality. It is worst in the poorest countries. That's where our aid is supposed to be going. So if we cut aid of necessity, we damage the position of women and girls. No wonder the FCDO didn't want to publish its impact assessment. It could not have been otherwise than the cuts would hurt women. So, no amount of "we can't afford this" can possibly excuse such an action from one of the richest countries on the planet. So the first thing to do is to restore the level of aid. If the minister cannot do that, then no amount of notes from the officials behind will actually answer that basic question. So my noble friend Lord Purvis is right that women and girls must be front and centre in terms of our new upcoming international development strategy. Will this be the case? So can I pull out a key area, and that's sexual health and reproductive rights. That is absolutely essential to women, their families, their communities and their countries. It's of fundamental importance as a pillar for achieving all other areas of gender equality. I recall when I was a DFID minister in one community where we supported family planning, and this image will always stay in my mind, of a young woman, probably in her teens, with twins attached to her, sitting on the ground, with other small children under 5 playing around her. And she was exhausted. And we know exactly why family planning would help her, and she knew why it would help her if she could give any energy and attention to it at all. Fewer children in a family means more of them in school, and the mother better able to earn a living, more likely to be able to take advantage of the possibilities of microfinance, as the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, mentioned. And we all know we face the climate emergency, as mentioned by the Noble Lady Baroness Armstrong, which indeed will roll back women's rights globally. The poorest and most vulnerable women and girls are often the most vulnerable to climate change and often lack the resources required to adapt to climate change and ensure the protection of their livelihoods and well-being. With increasing drought, women and girls are expected to travel longer distances to collect water and firewood, exposing them to further sexual and gender-based violence. The destruction of households and livelihoods have become a reality for communities hard hit by climate change. And in some cases, the loss of livelihood leads to increases in transactional sex and the risk of teenage pregnancies. Women are especially vulnerable in conflict, and conflict will be promoted by climate change. And I pay tribute to the Noble Baroness Hodgson, for her work in this area over so many years, and clearly her necessary work in the role of women in peace in Syria and now in Afghanistan. And when the West went into Afghanistan, I recall that at first people said that nothing could be done about women's rights because of the culture. But that was turned around so that the key change that occurred in Afghanistan was a dramatic improvement in women's rights, and the Noble Lady played her part in that. And it's heartbreaking to see that the Taliban are back in control and so much has been reversed, and that families are in such desperation that you now hear of people selling their kidneys. I'm glad we passed that amendment in the health bill, whichever night it was that we were here so late. Could the Noble Lady update us on what engagement we're having in Afghanistan, having had so little influence over the United States, despite claims post-Brexit, that they cut and run without our being able to exercise any influence over them whatsoever? We see even now the impact on women of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Women in Ukraine fleeing with their children, leaving behind their menfolk, their lives potentially changed forever, as Lord Lumba and others have mentioned. The mother hurt in the attack on the Mariupol hospital, then losing her own life and that of her baby. And during disasters, health services are often limited and at times not available, which means that more women give birth without much needed medical support. And Baroness Cox has spoken of the pressures in Sudan, Nigeria, and elsewhere. Lord Hussein has spoken of the situation of women in Kashmir and elsewhere. And then there's the multiple discrimination that Lord Lumba has often pointed to. Lord Seeker mentioned this in relation to the UK, and of course it applies even more internationally. Lord Lumba, in his work on widows, emphasises that they suffer the double discrimination of being women and widows. Older women can suffer particular discrimination. There's the double discrimination of women with disabilities. There's the multiple discrimination of women with disabilities, who are widows, and who are simply women. And yet the Sustainable Development Goals demand that no one is left behind. But the cuts that have been meted out undermine all of this. My Lords, there's so much that we will need to do if we are to deliver those Sustainable Development Goals in only a few years' time. We are not on track, even in the United Kingdom, to deliver the SDGs, certainly not worldwide. And the pandemic has meanwhile shown that we're all globally interconnected, and the war in Ukraine has shown the geopolitical tectonic plates shifting. How this will settle out is yet to be seen. But we must ensure that whatever the outcome, the position of women and girls and the need to fight for gender equality is not left behind. This has been as wide-ranging a debate as ever, and I certainly welcome the fact that we have something of a gender balance here. So it should be. I look forward to hearing what the noble lady, the Minister, says in reply. I think she will see that she has an uphill task and that words need to be matched with actions. She knows, if anyone does, that we can see through empty words.
Yeah. First, can I apologise to the committee for my seated comments to my noble friend? And I think I want to say something to the noble Lord, Lord Farmer Young and Clement Jones. All noble lords meaning very well indeed by what they've said, and I think we could all agree about the need for careful and respectful debate and not taking for granted or assuming what people might think and what they might be saying. And the only thing I would say to the noble lords is I've been a feminist all my life. And one of the things you learn as a feminist and someone who's been active in women's politics is that you actually need to be in control of the battles that you fight. Yeah. So all I say to the noble lords is, it's great that you feel as strongly as you do, but and please support me and my feminist friends in any way you can, but actually the fight is ours. And now I will turn to the theme of breaking the bias. I mean, I intend to make a speech which is about breaking the bias and about ending this prejudice and discrimination that women face on a daily basis in 2022. And like other noble lords, of course, who could not be absolutely choked up when you heard little Gabriella saying mummy to her mummy? I mean, oh my goodness me, is it not wonderful that that family is reunited? And I want to also pay tribute to my honourable friend Tulip Siddiq, the MP, for that family. And also wish everybody happy St Patrick's Day. I'd like to thank the noble lady, the Minister, for getting us this debate, because like other noble lords, I'm sure that she will agree that this debate deserves to be in the main chamber. And so I would just ask the noble lady to put it in the diary of the Leader of the House and the Chief Whip for next year and mount a campaign which we will all join her in making sure that we get the debate that we want on the special day when we want it. I did, however, visit Central London Co-op's wonderful International Women's Days debate at the National Memorial Arboretum last week and spent a very lovely morning there. Not New York, therefore, but actually a great event. And my job there was to speak about bias in my life and the lessons to be learned. So I thought I might mention a few biases that I have known and experienced. And the first one I want to mention is my late mum, Jean Thornton, the eldest of 11 children in a working-class family in Batley and Spen. I cannot remember a time in my life when I was not aware that my mum was top of her class in her primary school. She was very ill and failed to be able to take her 11+ exams. And despite the fact that her teachers really were very keen that she should take it, her family did not arrange for her to resit it. But they did send her brother to the grammar school the following year, and they couldn't afford 2 sets of uniforms. Now, she felt that missed opportunity literally all her life, which is why I can remember it. I've always known this story about my mum. That missed opportunity, that bias, and even though she made a great success of her working life, her public life, and had 7 children of her own, it did make her very ambitious for us.
So her 6 daughters, I'm the eldest of 7. And so when the head teacher suggested, and it has to be said that I was definitely a troublesome campaigning sixth former, I might not be university material, he thought, and should settle for a teacher training college. I wasn't actually sure that he'd escape with his life. I did indeed head to the LSE. And when I was in my early 30s, in the 1980s, I decided to take a pop at getting selected as a parliamentary candidate in Bradford when one of our Labour MPs had died. Now, those of you who have subjected yourself to the ordeal of trying to be selected in a parliamentary seat will know that what you have to do is attend a lot of meetings to sell yourself to the members of the local party. However, 2 of the meetings in this parliamentary selection were in local working men's clubs in Bradford, and I couldn't enter as a woman. I had to be signed in and escorted through the club. So I watched all the other candidates, who were all men, waltz into the selection, and I had to wait till the secretary came to sign me in and escort me to the meeting. At the time, I did probably what most of the women here would have done. You know, I just got on with it. I did the best speech I could, and I didn't, needless to say, of course, I did not get selected. But it did harden me, and it gave me a campaigning zeal to change Labour Party selection rules and to ensure that there would be a great pipeline of women ready to stand for election. So in 1997, we saw the 100+ women, Labour women, and now over half of our parliamentary Labour Party is women. And we all experience bias, be it minor and annoying. For example, I am fairly sure that when I came to your Lordship's house in 1998, Conservative women here in the House didn't wear trousers. There was, I don't know whether it was a rule or a form or what, but they didn't wear trousers. It simply wasn't done. And
same in the courts.
Same in the courts. In 1998, women peers had 2 little toilets, the ones up by the chamber. The men still all had the splendid Victorian ones, but we gained the one just round the corner within a few years. And then, of course, the bias goes to the downright dangerous and discriminatory. I have an admiration for the organisation Pregnant But Screwed. And partly that is because when I was pregnant with my first child, I was, without doubt, the most senior person in the whole cooperative movement who'd ever taken maternity leave. And I wasn't that senior, actually. But the chair of the committee for which I worked simply thought I was being very awkward and very uncooperative by not saying exactly when I was going to return to work after my baby was born. Now, today, of course, I would have known to take a complaint and had them in a tribunal as quickly as you could look at, as you like. But I didn't know, and so I just had not as happy a time of my pregnancy as I should have had. And in the medical and health world in which I work, there's a clinical bias that of medicines and devices that are designed and tested on men still. That is changing, but still. And it's, of course, potentially dangerous and certainly can be very uncomfortable indeed. And, my lords, the bias, otherwise known as misogynism, in our police, which has been mentioned already, has appalling consequences, both for individual women and their treatment, and we know about Sarah Everard, and most recently, actually, a young girl, strip-searched at her school, including the removal of her sanitary wear by 2 police, traumatised by her treatment, without her mother or an adult present. And we have the lowest rate convictions for an age has already been mentioned by Noble Laws, and also the Dame Vera Bird. You know, she said 1.5% reach court. That means 98% go on. So we've argued for the inclusion of domestic abuse and sexual offences in the definition of serious violence. We've argued for violence against women and girls to be a strategic policing issue, given the same prominence as terrorism and organised crime. We've argued for safeguards to be set out on the extraction of data from victims' phones. We've argued for the lifting of of the limit of prosecution for common assault and battery and domestic abuse cases. We've argued for a review into spiking so we can get to the bottom of this appalling practice. None of these measures, my lords, were included in the government's original bill. They are all there as a result of the campaigning work of women's organisations and the Labour Party, and I have to say Liberal Democrats and other members of your Lordship's House. We have changed the law for the better for women. And I think the government has been asked some very personal questions by my noble friend Baroness Kennedy about ensuring that misogyny is a hate crime, about publishing the perpetrator strategy as the domestic abuse bill requires at the end of the month. The government must adopt these measures. And my noble lords, turning to the area in which I work, which is health. We do need the Women's Health Strategy to be produced. I am very pleased that the Secretary of State has now said it will be produced because the UK has been found to have the largest female health gap in the G20 and the 12th largest globally. Research has shown a gender health gap in the UK where many women receive poorer health care than men, routinely misunderstood, mistreated and misdiagnosed. So there is still a great deal of work to do. And I very briefly want to turn to the international issues which have been mentioned by several noble lords. And I just want to add my voice to say what a short-sighted, counterproductive decision to reduce funding for women and girls across the world at every single level. And I urge the noble lady, the Minister, to put every single, mentioned by Noble Lord Purvis, mentioned by the Bishop of Durham, mentioned by my noble friend Lady Armstrong, mentioned by virtually everybody. We need to return the funding for women and girls to pre-2020 levels, and it requires a return of the 1.9 billion in programming, and we need it now. My lords, we cannot afford not to find it. I just want to mention two other issues. One is to do with bias and tone. The current Secretary of State for Health and his predecessor have both called out my honourable colleague Rosina Aline Khan at the dispatch box because they didn't appreciate her tone. And I think that makes me actually quite angry. Because actually when men do that, when men say to women, "You're not using the right tone, my dear," what they're actually saying is, "You shouldn't be speaking at all. Please speak only with our permission." That's what they're saying. And I place that on the table, and I think that, and don't worry, my honourable friend Rosina is absolutely aware that what's happening is that those men are saying that she shouldn't be speaking. Just finally, the Labour Party is the party of equality. We are the party of the Equal Pay Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, the Equality Act. We understand that our society, our economy, our country is poorer if women cannot play their full part. Women hold the key to a stronger economy. My noble friend Lord Seeker was quite right. And indeed, I have been asking all the time I have been in the House for about gender impact assessments. We've been asking them for many years. I think the noble lady should add that. I plead with her to add that to her to-do list. And International Women's Day is always a bittersweet moment. It's to celebrate how far we've come, which is a great distance. Certainly in the time I've been in your Lordship's house, it's a great distance. But it's also to note with regret how far we still have to go, and a chance to recommit ourselves to the struggle for women, the girls of today, for our daughters and our granddaughters of tomorrow. Women across the country deserve security, prosperity and respect, and across the world. We think a Labour government will give them that, but for as long as we're still on these benches, we will push the government to deliver it.
Well, here's to Mission Impossible.
My Lords, I will do my very best to answer as many questions as I can. I'm absolutely sure I won't be able to do them all, but I will, with my officials, make sure that I write a letter and make sure every question is answered, and you all receive a copy of it, and a copy will go in the library. It is definitely not a second-class debate, I can tell you. Definitely not. And I will say to the Noble Baroness Northover, I have a great mantra: it's not what you say, it's what you do, and it's not what you promise, it's what you deliver. And that's what we should all be judged on. And just if I may have a moment to the Noble Lord Young, William Booth was absolutely at the head of equality. And when he was commissioning men as lieutenants and captains and all the rest of it, there were as many women all holding the same rank as men. There was no differential. He was. So, my Lords, we've heard some powerful and moving and challenging questions today from across the chamber, and I thank all noble lords who've contributed today. The richness of this debate shows how important it is that we have the opportunity to mark International Women's Day, highlighting the wide range of challenges that disproportionately affect women, preventing them from accessing the opportunities to help them thrive. If I may, I'd like to deal with one of the elephants in the room, and that is not having this on the day that so many wanted it. And I remember you asked me this in an oral question, and I did go and find out, and I am advised, and I had no reason to disbelieve it, that Usual Channels agreed time for the debate as soon as possible, and I will make the case as much as I can to have it on a better day. Okay. I have actually agreed to meet with you to do that, and I stand by that right now. I'd like to start by talking about Ukraine. I mean, there's many things to talk about in respect of Ukraine. Lord Clement Jones and Lord Lumba and others have mentioned it. We're absolutely committed to supporting Ukrainian women and girls, recognising the critical contribution women are making on the front line and in the communities affected by the conflict. Somebody was telling me that the women were making Molotov cocktails to try and keep the Russians, so all power to their elbow. We are particularly concerned about the impact of the conflict on women and girls. They will be more exposed to the risk of violence, particularly sexual and gender-based violence, and we acknowledge the vital work of civil society organisations. I think I'm a poached-term gamekeeper, I think, in that respect. So you can be assured of my support for good civil society organisations. And I would just reflect, when I stood with the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN on Monday, and he asked me to do one thing, and that was to come back here and to ask everybody, regardless of politicians, asked everybody, when these women and children come to our country, we must help them integrate into our communities. Because if we don't, the sex traffickers will get hold of them, they'll be forced into prostitution, there'll be forced adoptions, and the list goes on. And I gave him my word I would do that. So I'm asking you today to get that message out, to make sure we can stand by the need of the ambassador. And I didn't attend all the concert at the Met, but I was there, and there was a Ukrainian bass singer who sang their national anthem. Okay? And he fell into the arms of the conductor afterwards. And such was the depth of despair he felt. So let's all continue to stand by these dear people who need us. Let me just answer the question about the Istanbul ratification. The UK remains strongly committed to ratification of the Istanbul Convention, and almost all of the obstacles to ratification have now been removed, and we should be in a position to ratify the Convention quite soon. Right? I didn't think that was funny. Sorry, I didn't think that was funny. It was, okay, well, I was being very serious. Okay. The Noble Baroness Gale and Lord Purvis of Tweed mentioned about political representation. They gave some figures of the balance of people, but we must congratulate the Greens on a 100% record. I think it's worthy of mention. I think later on, if I get to answer it, we'll come on to the issue of women in political life and the abuse that goes with that. The government continues to keep Section 106 of the Equality Act 2010 under review, but remains of the view that political parties should lead the way in improving diverse electoral representation through their own selection. The Noble Lord Purvis of Tweed talked about the development strategy, having women and girls right throughout it. The government will publish a new international development strategy this spring, and that will guide our work for the coming decades and beyond. The new strategy will prioritise spending on life-saving humanitarian aid and support women and girls, and the Foreign Secretary is committed and will go through the business plan and the strategy development. Again, Baroness Armstrong and Noble Lord Purvis talked about, and others, about an equality impact assessment of the ODA cuts. We treat equality issues seriously, and the UK is a leading global voice on women and girls and LGBT disability and wider human rights. We've got processes in place through spending reviews and FCDO business planning to ensure we meet our legal obligations. The equalities assessment was a snapshot in March 21, aimed at predicting how spending decisions for 21-22 would impact protected groups. As we move through the project cycle, we will review the actual impact of the spending. Again, on scrutiny and transparency, which was raised, we fulfil our international legal and public transparency commitments and continue to be accountable to Parliament and to taxpayers for how we spend UK aid, and to mandate our partners to be transparent. The Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Durham, mentioned Lesotho, and one of the things that came out of this week, somebody asked the question, why aren't women in the room when decisions are made? Because the decisions will be very different. So we want women in the room, we want women in the chair, and we want women in the lead. I come now to the question asked many times by the Right Reverend Prelate about the 2-child limit. Last time I answered it, I got told off for being a little discourteous, so let me be as polite as I can. Nothing has changed since I answered the question last time, and there's nothing else I can say that will help you. The Noble Right Reverend Prelate, Bishop of Durham, Lord Sandhurst mentioned childcare, and this is going to be absolutely critical if we want women to be in work, we want to get women back to work, and we want to get women into better jobs. And I had the pleasure of talking to the people from Australia, New Zealand, Canada and Denmark, and we formed, this is an unholy alliance, I think is what you call it, and we're going to exchange information about what happens in our own countries and try and see if we can learn from each other to make improvements. But it is absolutely critical, because childcare is stopping women taking more hours, it's stopping them progressing, and we should redouble our efforts to find solutions to make that better. The Right Reverend Prelate raised the issue about the official development assistant budget for women and girls. On funding decisions, the Foreign Secretary has been clear that we intend to restore funding to women and girls and to humanitarian programmes. Our spending review in 2021 highlighted that we will increase aid funding for our highest priorities. We are bound by the UK International Development Act, Gender Equality 2014, to ensure that gender equality remains at the heart of the UK's work on international development and humanitarian crisis. And I think this is the question you want me to answer. In November, the Foreign Secretary announced she would restore funding for women and girls to pre-ODA cut levels, and the baseline year and timing of restoration is under discussion as part of the Foreign Office's business planning process. So it's going to be done. I can't tell you when, but that's one that I won't let go, so you get the answer that you need. To mark International Women's Day, the UK was proud to launch new funding for women's rights organisations and civil society actors, and there is a £220 million pot of humanitarian aid which we're making our largest ever aid match to, and it's going to contribute to the Disasters Emergency Committee Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal and matching the first 25 million donated. So it's not insignificant. My noble friend Baroness Hodgson asked about the new convention to hold perpetrators of sexual violence account. As part of the Network of Liberty, the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative remains a key focus for the UK Government, and the Foreign Secretary has made tackling sexual violence in conflict one of her top priorities. In November 21, again, the Foreign Secretary announced her intention to work towards a new convention on sexual violence in conflict, and this is an opportunity to strengthen the international response to preventing these atrocities and supporting survivors and holding perpetrators to account. My noble friend Baroness Hodgson, and I can't remember exactly who, asked about Afghan and what's going on there, so I will write on that one. Baroness Armstrong of Hilltop talked about rollback of rights, and the UK is recognised as a world leader in defending and promoting women and girls' rights. We have a reputation for addressing often neglected or difficult issues on the global stage, such as sex education and relationships, access to safe abortion, female genital mutilation, child marriage and gender-based violence. In negotiations at the UN and in other multilateral fora, the UK stands firm against organised attempts to undermine women and girls' rights, including a big discussion at this year's Commission on the Status of Women. I would also say to the noble Baroness Lady Armstrong that I would be very, very pleased to learn about VSO. So if you want to jack up a meeting, I'll be there. And the other point I wanted to make was I was listening to a very powerful story from a minister from Chad, and how their water has completely run out and they can't grow food and they can't look after themselves. So it was heart-rending, really. Let me just... In terms of engaging with women's organisations, I've been holding a series of roundtables with women across England to discuss the impact of COVID-19. And again, I hosted a roundtable at the UN with civil society organisations. And if there's an organisation you think I should speak to, please let me know, and I will endeavour to meet with them. Noble Lord Hussain mentioned Kashmir, and we do recognise there are many human rights concerns on Indian-administered Kashmir and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. We encourage all states to ensure domestic laws in line with international standards, and the British High Commission in New Delhi and our network of Deputy High Commissioners work closely with Indian civil society and non-governmental organisations to promote gender equality and tackle gender-based violence. Gosh. The Noble Lord did ask me to write, so if you can leave that with me, I will do that afterwards, if I may. Time is not on my side today, that's for sure. Can I just say, that my noble friend, Lord Farmer, made a really good point about somebody. I can't say her name, so I'm not going to embarrass myself. But she is a sign, and we should make sure that we give our support in that way. Lord Farmer mentioned about sport, and it's something that everyone in the country should feel able to take part in. It's for sporting bodies to set the guidelines about trans people in sporting competitions. My noble, I always call people my friends because it just happens to come out, but the noble Baroness, here we are, Baroness Kennedy, he talked about violence against women and women not being able to walk up the street for fear of what happened and the terrible abuse, both verbal and physical, that they get. And I will take back the point you make about what's going on in Scotland. And I'm advised that we'll be publishing a new hate crime strategy in due course, which will take the Law Commission's recommendations into account. But let's be under no illusion, it's serious stuff and it needs dealing with. Okay. The noble Baroness Cox, who I agree is an inspiration in matters of international issues, asked about support for Burma. Myanmar is a focus country for the UK Women's Peace and Security National Action Plan, as well as the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative. The UK has sought to integrate support for GBV survivors across its humanitarian and development programme and has provided flexible funding to women and to LGBT-led organisations. The UK is also supporting the UN LIFT fund to reduce risks of trafficking and support survivors. And I think the term deaf ear was mentioned, okay? So we'll turn the volume up on that one and do our best. Sorry, I'm ignoring people, I'm just trying to be... yeah. Now, my noble friend Lord Sandhurst, and again the noble Baroness Kennedy, and in fact noble Baroness Thornton, raised the issue of sexual harassment, and it's just not on. Every woman should be able to live without fear of harassment or violence in the workplace as much as anywhere else. As debate about the future of the workplace proceeds, the government is committed to making sure people feel safe and supported to thrive. The noble Lord Clement Jones made a very important point about freedom of speech, and I fully support him. And I also know that I can count on all noble lords to be respectful of each other's views, and that if we don't show respect, we won't get the debate that we need. And we may not agree with each other on certain things, but we've got to have an open and honest debate. The noble Lord Loombar was delighted that you were working with Rotary International and Rotary in this country. I think it's a great organisation, and sometimes the things it does not get the credit it should. So perhaps you'll go back and thank them from me for what they're doing with your efforts to raise money for this important appeal. Noble Lord Purvis of Tweed raised the issue of South Sudan. On Sudan, Her Majesty's Government is committed to continuing to support sexual and reproductive health rights in Sudan for 22 and 23, and our female genital mutilation funding will continue until next year. And on South Sudan, as part of our humanitarian assistance and resilience building in South Sudan, we have a programme called Harris. We fund a 6-year, 25 million UK-funded programme. International medical corporations work with communities and local authorities to raise awareness on gender-based violence, to improve safety for women in their communities, provide confidential and survivor-centred case management and psychosocial support. I am out of time, and I am feeling that I've failed you miserably in answering these questions. But I've got the answers, and as I said, I'm going to write to you, and I'm going to make sure they're all answered. So you've got homework to do. They won't be passing notes; they'll be writing with pens. So, if I may bring the debate to a conclusion, huge thanks for your contributions, and I stand ready to do my bit as much as I'm able to on this particular issue, and especially to stand up for women. So with that, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as that opinion will say content, contrary not content, the contents have it. My Lords, that completes the work of the Grand Committee this afternoon. The committee stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended.